Okay, today is Wednesday, November 9th, 2022. I am Hansen Sue with Glenn Reid. So to begin, where and when were you born?
Where and when was I born? I was born in East Lansing, Michigan, April 14th, 1961.
Okay. And is that where you grew up?
No, my dad was a physicist, so we moved around between government labs and universities. I was there for 9 months. I don't remember it. I grew up in the suburbs of D.C. My dad worked for the Navy and solving hard problems, I guess. So it was a terrible place to grow up, the suburbs of D.C., so I got out of there as soon as possible.
And did your mom work or just did?
No, she had 6 kids on her hands, so she worked later in life. She had got a master's in math and ended up being a math teacher after the 6 kids were out of the house, and reinvented herself at age 50, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, wow. And so you have 5 siblings. That's quite a lot.
Yeah.
Are you older or younger?
I'm the 5th out of 6, so 5 boys and 1 girl, if you can imagine that.
Wow.
The girl's the youngest, so she's got 5 older brothers.
So were you competitive?
I was not competitive at all, so my older brothers were excellent in various things, such that there was nothing left for me to be excellent at, so I became a generalist in a way. And I don't have a competitive bone in my body. I don't care. Winning is arbitrary, and accomplishment I'm in favor of, but competition and besting someone else, it's not really in my DNA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What did you do for fun as a child?
We lived on the edge of sort of a forest, so I ran around in the woods and kicked soccer balls at the wall, and there wasn't a whole lot to do except there happened to be an Olympic-sized swimming pool right in walking distance, so I basically spent my childhood at the pool and on the swim team and lifeguarding and all that. I wouldn't exactly call it fun, but it was something to do.
Right. What were your best and worst subjects at school?
I was sort of a gifted and lazy student, so I, dabbled in lots of things, and since I wasn't really competitive, I didn't care how well I did at things, but I would say math and English and languages. I took Latin and French and sort of, again, sort of a generalist, I guess. Later on, when I was in college, I ended up switching my major my senior year, so I have a degree in computer science. I'm 9 credits away from an English degree and 9 credits away from a mechanical engineering degree, so definitely more broad than deep, I guess you might say.
Yeah, interesting. What were your parents' ethnic backgrounds?
Totally white. We're half English and half Scottish, almost directly. In fact, both of my parents were half English and half Scottish, so unusual way to come by it.
Interesting. Any religious or political affiliations?
No, card-carrying atheist, actually, so I don't know if that's an affiliation or not.
I guess if the scientist, yeah.
Yeah, it never made any sense to me.
Did you have any mentors growing up?
No, in fact, I was completely ignored for most of my childhood, so in fact, that turned out to be a great thing because I had to figure everything out for myself or it wasn't going to happen. So my mom was busy with 6 kids, and being the 5th out of 6, I could literally do anything I wanted and she didn't notice, so I had no need to rebel. I was a completely, perfect kid. I went to bed on time. I didn't drink till I was 27 and drove the speed limit and all that, so but yeah, nobody paid any attention to me.
Interesting. Who were your heroes growing up?
Well, I don't know. I don't really have a hero thing, although I admire the work that people do, I guess. And I kind of admire Richard Branson. I just sort of think his attitude and the things he's done are amazing. He just doesn't get slowed down by the fact that he shouldn't start an airline or whatever. Elon Musk for a while, but he's such a crazy person. I can't say I admire him anymore, but he'll do anything, and I think that's a great attribute. I kind of like some of the unsung heroes, the founders that you guys study. A lot of these, scientists who laid down the groundwork for everything. They don't get a lot of attention, but I admire those people, and I know some of them, and I'm related to some of them. So, but yeah, and going back into history, people like Nikola Tesla, and I don't know. I don't really have a whole list of heroes, I guess.
So like inventor types.
Yeah, people who just do things and do new things in particular. I think as a species we tend to be herd-like animals and follow people around and do what everybody else does. So in fact, I tell people who want to know how to innovate, like, get rid of phrases like best practices. If you're adopting best practices, by definition, you're not innovating because you're doing what everybody else is doing. And if you wander off the path, you don't always do something new and great, but you're certainly not going to do something new and great if you are following everybody else. There's an old saying that if you're a sled dog, unless you're the lead dog, the view is always the same,
Nice. What sorts of books did you read, or other media did you consume?
I didn't read a lot. Well, I did in the middle years, I guess, and mostly nonfiction stuff. I like books about mechanical things and history and whatever. I read some literature, but only things my teachers made me read. But I haven't read anything in at least 15 years. Not because I'm not interested in it, because it's always something more immediate that I need to be doing. And I don't have any problem falling asleep, so I don't need to read to fall asleep.
Nice. So where did you go to college?
University of Wisconsin at Madison, which was an accident. A lot of my life was a series of accidents, and I think I mentioned I was kind of a lazy kid, and in high school in those days, there was no internet, so I think I did well on the NMSQT, National Merit Tests or whatever, so I got on mailing lists from colleges, and they send you pieces of paper. And I only applied to 2 colleges, the ones that sent me an application form without me having to write away and ask for it. And there was no application fee. Those were my criteria. They were good schools, UW-Madison and Georgia Tech, and I just chose Madison sort of randomly, but it was a great school, and my dad taught at a lot of different universities, Michigan State and Purdue, and he pushed us toward big state schools. He liked the diversity of thought, and there's just lots going on. You can find things you didn't even know you were interested in. So I think there were 40,000 undergraduates or something. So it was a big school.
Yeah. So you went to high school. When you went to high school, you were still living in DC?
Maryland, yeah.
Okay.
Up until I went to college, and my parents got divorced while I was in college, so just nothing really to go back to. So I kind of stayed in my life raft and floated around for the next several years and figured it out.
So you mentioned you were originally an English major, or you were a mechanical engineering major, or a double?
Mechanical engineering first, and Madison, if you wanted to major in engineering, you had to declare your major as an entering freshman because there was so much to do. I think kids. I have two kids that are college age now, and one just out, and I kind of realize now you have no idea what mechanical engineering is when you say you want to major in it. It just sounds good. And I was interested in making things and designing things, but I was taking some computer science classes some of them were required, and then they were kind of interesting. And it was a time in history where the computer industry was just beginning. This was, I don't know, 1978 is when I graduated high school. So I actually used punch cards and the yellow teletype machines and stuff, but I was enjoying those computer science classes, and I just kept taking more of them. And that whole lack of supervision thing, nobody was checking in on me and finding out how much progress I was making toward my major or anything. I was just kind of on my own. So my senior year, I switched my major from mechanical engineering to computer science because it felt like the Dr. Seuss version of mechanical engineering. Mechanical stuff, there are physical properties that get in the way, like you take strength of materials and you find out at what forces things break, and in software doesn't happen. Nothing breaks, so you can design a little machine with a guy pedaling and a propeller spinning, all that Dr. Seuss stuff, and if it works once, it'll work a million times. So it was sort of a more fun version of, I think it's still very mechanical in my mind, sort of the way things execute feels a lot like machinery. So to me, it felt like the perfect version of mechanical engineering because there weren't any rules and nothing broke, and you didn't have to pay for the materials and all that. The College of Engineering and the College of Letters and Science had different base requirements, so I ended up taking 2 more years to get out of school. So, 6 years in a 4-year program, but my degree ended up, and it's funny, I have a BA degree in computer science, which is also unusual, but Madison has a very strong foreign language program, so I'd taken 2 years of French and 2 years of Latin in high school, and I found out if you took, third year French and you got an A or a B, they gave you retro credit for the previous semester. So I got a 12 credit A for French, 4 credits times 3, I guess, and so I was like, oh, heck, I'm taking third semester Latin, too. I can see that, ring that bell. That was kind of funny being in a third semester Latin. There were, I think, 8 students in the class. The first day, they're like, introduce yourselves, and these people are like, classics major, classics, Latin, classics, mechanical engineering, So it just ended up that I had more credits toward a BA than I did a BS by the time I got to the finish line. So it's sort of unusual to have a Bachelor of Arts degree in a science field, but in a way it shaped my path here. So I took a lot of classes that were outside the requirement list because they interested me, and I took, poetry workshops and English grammar classes, and there was one semester I was taking a class in computational linguistics in the computer science department and transformational grammar in the English department, and they were very, very similar, but they had no idea that each other existed. The computer science professors didn't go and talk to the English professors, I don't think so. But interest in language, and I took a calligraphy class and actually multiple classes in that, and that led to typography and getting a job at Adobe in the early days. So I think having strayed outside the boundaries ended up being a really good thing. Yeah. At least I can claim that in retrospect.
Right, yeah. So is that how you ended up almost getting an English degree as well?
Yeah, I took so many classes that, I went back and looked later, like, wow, a couple more classes, I could have had an English degree. I'm glad I didn't, because I'd be working at Starbucks probably.
Somehow I doubt that, but it's also interesting. So you said you took Latin in high school, so not a lot of high schools offer Latin.
True, and I don't know why mine did, but and they had Russian, and it was, I don't know, maybe there were spies and stuff in the suburbs of D.C. that informed the language department. I'm not sure.
Interesting.
But yeah, and my Latin professor was amazing. Not professor, just teacher. And my sister, 2 years younger, also took Latin, and Latin teaches you more about English than English classes do. Just the structure of language and stuff that you can think, I don't know, English education in the U.S. turns mostly into literature and reading and writing, and very, very little of it is about grammar and structure, and that's really all you learn in Latin because nobody speaks the language. You just sort of dissect it. So, and, you know, structural analysis of language ends up being part of computer science as well. So it was fascinating to, what's funny because, so Glenn, the lazy student, picture me in third semester Latin in college with other things to do. It was every day of the week. It was 5 times a week, and the poor professor had a stammer or stutter that he couldn't say a sentence without every syllable being repeated 4 or 5 times. So we had to be patient to get the message. And I really didn't do any work in that class. I would show up and not do any of my homework or anything. But basically all you do is translate old texts about Julius Caesar and everything. And we would sit there, you know, on 9 o'clock in the morning, and he would have us read back the translations we had done the night before, except I didn't do them. So, but he would take us in order in the class, and I always sat in the back. So I counted sentences and I counted people, and I would translate my sentence while I'm, you know, in real time, if you will, and, you know, look up words or whatever. So I kind of got by, and then the first test was difficult, shall we say. It was basically a giant passage of Latin, and, you know, please translate it, and you have 3 hours kind of thing. And once you get the basic structure of Latin, it's all vocabulary, and a lot of those words are complicated, and I just didn't know them. So I felt, okay, here I'm failing this test, you know, and kind of just, I recognized maybe every 5th word. So I'm writing, and I knew it was about some battle in ancient, you know, Rome. So I turned it in, and I wrote something in Latin like "woe is me" at the end, and figured that was abysmal. And when he handed back the exams on Monday, he kept mine. He didn't hold it. He didn't hand it back to me, and I thought, oh, you know, this is bad. But he gave me an A+, and asked me to read it out loud, and I was astonished. But in retrospect, I realized what I had done was interpret the text. I couldn't translate it literally because I didn't know most of the words, but I kind of got the sense of it. And most people translating Latin will write, you know, the battle having been waged and the river crossed. You know, they mechanically translate it, and it sounds stilted. And mine, as a piece of English, read well because it, you know, I could write well, and he just thought I was doing a brilliant translation instead of having no idea what it was about. And I felt like such a fraud. Like, you have no idea how poorly I understood that, but I you know, I saw river in there, and I saw, you know, army, so I made up a story that was based on the original. So I ended up getting an A in Latin, which I did not deserve, and, you know, I'll cash that check. But it's funny how holistic learning sometimes works to your advantage, you know, and you don't want your kids to not do their homework, but kind of making sure you bring your ability to write English sentences to your Latin class. I think in retrospect that I found that path well, and I'm way afield of whatever your question was. Sorry about that.
No, that was a very fascinating story. Did you? Who were your important influencers in college?
That's a question I can't really answer. I kind of didn't know any of my professors. I never went to office hours. You know, I was kind of that forgotten kid. So whatever I would read probably was what influenced me, and not the people so much. My one calligraphy professor was sort of this amazing old guy. He had written a book. He's the closest thing, I think, to an influencer that I had. And when I skipped second grade. My dad, being a teacher, thought he didn't learn anything in second grade, so he marched into the administration, and all of us skipped second grade just as a matter of course. So I was 17 my whole freshman year of college, and I think I'd turned 18, and my professor, I'm struggling to remember his name, but he was probably 75, and he introduced me to the Wisconsin Calligraphers Guild. It was sort of a small group of people who were into calligraphy, and there were, I don't know, 6 or 7 people, all of whom were in their 70s, and I was 18. But I'm part of this group all of a sudden, and I was on the board of directors of the Wisconsin Calligraphers Guild, and basically we'd go to some old lady's house and have tea, but they were fantastically talented. Like, I think gilding is the right word, where you actually put gold leaf, the way they used to do manuscripts and stuff. So there was a woman who was an expert in that, and she made me a beautiful piece that probably is worth some money today if I could find it. But it was a strange thing for an 18-year-old kid to be doing, and I got really good at lettering and calligraphy. And when they had an event where Donald Jackson, who was scribe to Queen Elizabeth, came to do a presentation, and I got to design the posters that went up on the telephone poles and everything. And that was an amazing experience. He used a quill pen, goose quill, and cut the end of it and everything, which I know how to do too. And I learned something profound from him. If you look at fonts, typefaces, letter forms, most of them have sort of a thick and thin, and they're typically on a bias, so it's thin this way and thick this way. It's based on the shape of the pen. And most of the calligraphy that I'd done and had watched other people do is sort of meticulous. You're going like this. And here's this guy who literally, when the Queen of England would make a proclamation, he would get out his quill pen and write it out, the old-fashioned way on parchment and stuff. So, but he could write as fast with this goose quill pen as you or I would write with a ballpoint pen. It's just like, whoo, whoo, whoo. And I was astonished by that. But I've realized since that is why the letters have the shapes that they do, because if you make them rapidly, they tend to have these little tails on them and so on. And it was, instead of trying to meticulously do that, the letters followed the way that you wrote them as opposed to the other way around. So he was just writing as fast as he could with it, and it was perfect, and I had never seen anybody do that before, and it made me realize that that's deeply embedded in why the letters have the shapes that they do. Is just, if you took that pen and wrote as fast as you could, it would look like that too.
Right. That's just naturally how it would look.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's sort of, people think that they designed letters and then figured out how to write them. I think it was the other way around. They're like, look, I can use this feather, and, and then the letters happen to look like that. But yeah, calligraphy ended up being my path into typography and Adobe and Next and all that stuff. So I didn't know it at the time. In fact, Steve Jobs apparently took a class in calligraphy at Reid College, and the difference between him and me is I graduated and he didn't. But but his interest in it also led to laser printers and that sort of thing. So it was a lucky accident to take that class, and my dad would never have approved, so he didn't know, luckily.
Going back a little bit, what was the first program that you ever wrote?
So another reason that I'm sitting here was, for whatever reason, my high school and this was, 1976. They had the math department, the math teacher had a teletype in the back room, and it was connected to a PDP 11 something in the county. There was and there was acoustic modems you would dial in, and there were a few of us that he let use that, and we didn't really know what it was, but I kind of started playing around with it and writing programs in BASIC, and literally, you have one of these in the museum I was admiring, and the way you would save something was, a yellow paper tape. It would punch holes in it, and so you'd bring your little paper tape and read it back in. And he didn't really supervise us, but I was trying to figure out how to do this stuff, and I think the input was these weird cylindrical keys, but the output was yellow roll paper. So I wrote a program that was my excuse for a video game, except there's no video. I had been learning in math or something about trajectories of projectiles and, that sort of thing. So there was something where you would type in an angle and a velocity, and it would launch a projectile and tell you if you hit something over there. And then it would use up a bunch of yellow paper to draw the parabola with, dots or plus signs or whatever. And I probably fussed over that for weeks, trying to mostly just getting it to print out and using way too much paper in retrospect. But I think that's probably classifies as the first program I ever wrote. No one used it ever but me. It's funny to have a video game that only you play, and I don't really do video games. I don't know why I wrote that program. The second program I wrote was, I bought an Atari 800 computer with my own money, which was crazy.
In high school or later?
In high school, yeah.
Wow.
And I wanted to connect it to this school computer so I could keep doing stuff, but there was no terminal emulator for the Atari 800, so I had to write my own, and there was a programming language for it called Action, which was pretty amazing at that point in history. So I got some book on VT100 terminal codes and how they would do reverse video, and basically wrote this thing. But we didn't have much money, and I didn't have an actual disk drive to save my work on, so there was a cassette drive that would write it out to tape, and it was basically, I think it saved it as analog somehow. It was super unreliable, and I would say 1 time in 10, it failed to read back in, and I would lose the entire thing and have to just start over again. So I started to save it to 3 different cassettes and whatever, but I would say I lost that program somewhere between 10 and 20 times, just completely gone. And you go through that, oh man, But when I started over again, it was always better and smaller and faster because I didn't have to remember what to do. And, I kind of think today people should delete their source code periodically and start over. You don't, making backups and everything, sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is to lose the whole thing. And you have to go through a period of grief, but it kept getting better when I started from scratch. And I still don't do that. I don't delete my own source code, but that's in the back of my mind somewhere, like maybe what you learned while writing this was actually learning, and it shouldn't still be in there. You should start with what you learn and start over. But one thing I've learned in the industry is there's no such thing as a throwaway prototype, even though there should be. Like, you keep it and you keep hacking on it and it becomes your product. So do a good job at the beginning, like write production code from the get-go. Don't write throwaway crap code, because you're going to keep it and it's going to be in the product, and might as well do it right the first time if you can. But yeah, that was a program of necessity, I guess, writing a VT100 terminal emulator. Did work pretty well, but I didn't have anything really to do when I finally got logged in to the county computer. There might have been bulletin boards that I was getting into or something, but I didn't have a whole lot of time available to do that. It was just curiosity, I guess, but it definitely led to switching to computer science probably at some point. I don't think a lot of high schools had that kind of equipment looking back on it. There weren't that many teletypes in the world. I don't know what one was doing in my high school.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm just wondering, like, given your high school was in the DC suburbs, probably an affluent area of Maryland.
Not terribly affluent, but not far from affluent areas. We weren't far from University of Maryland, College Park, too, so there may have been some residual effect
right.
there.
And then people living there may be working for the parents may have worked for the government.
Yeah, that's possible.
Just wondering if, like, the more highly resourced school district than average.
Doesn't seem like it. It was a pretty miscellaneous feeling neighborhood and school.
It was a public school, though.
Yeah. So I don't know.
Yeah, that does seem unusual for a public school to have a Latin program and
yeah. Although sometimes I think it ends up being a side effect of one teacher that they hire to teach French ends up also, he's like, how about if we start Latin? It might be something like that.
Right.
There were quite a few of these kind of multilingual, I think he was Serbian or some random thing, so maybe he was a spy hiding out in a public school.
Okay, so let's get to so Adobe was your first job out of college.
Not quite.
Oh, not quite.
So when I graduated, I had no idea what I was going to do. They did bring some companies in to interview you, and I actually interviewed with Microsoft when all they had was the C compiler, I think, and decided not to work for them, which I guess is a good thing in retrospect, but that would have been a pretty cushy existence.
What year was that?
84.
84. So that was the year you graduated.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I went out to Maine. One of my brothers is an accountant, and he worked at a truck stop, and they had PDP-11 computers that they couldn't get to do what they needed to do. And I said, I think I could help you with that. And so I went and kind of did contract work for him, and I think my yearly income that year was $7,000. It wasn't exactly a great job, but I was living with my brother and just literally didn't know what else to do. But they had RL02 disk drives, which was a platter about, I don't know, 1.5 feet in diameter, 2 inches thick, and it stored 5 megabytes in that massive platter. So you'd have to change those out. So I did that for a year. But my oldest brother, who's 11 years older than me, he has a degree from Carnegie Mellon, and he was teaching at Stanford, actually, and he had done more or less a typesetting system as his graduate thesis, and he was kind of advising the people at Palo Alto Research Center, and he knew all the Adobe founders, so he's like, hey, I think you should come out here and check out Adobe. So I learned about Adobe from him, but he didn't want to sort of get in the middle of it. But I got a hold of Liz Bond, and my brother didn't think I was smart or hardworking or worthwhile, so he assumed I would be in the marketing team in some way and not actually, like, in fact, he always said that they shouldn't even teach computer science to undergraduates. Like, that should be a graduate program, and you should learn more basic things like math. But so I got connected to this woman who ran marketing, and I got a hold of the PostScript manual before it was published and just read up on it. So I wrote a letter in PostScript without any way to test it. I just was looking at the manual.
Oh, wow.
and figuring out how it would, Dear Ms. Bond, I would love to work at Adobe. You know, Glenn Reid was short, but it was all a PostScript program, and she typed it in and sent it to the printer, and luckily it worked. And so I think she was sort of amazed that I did that, and hired me. And so I, drove across the country and started work at Adobe. I was 23 or 24 or whatever. So basically it was my first job, except there was this little brief period of time.
Right. So you drove to California from Maine.
Right.
Wow.
In a Ryder truck pulling my car behind. The truck, that time the national speed limit was 55. And the truck had a governor on it that wouldn't go above 55 except 57 really. And I got out on the first time it kicked in. I was like, I'm going to disable that thing, but they'd sprayed it with foam, and they knew someone wanted to tamper with it, so I couldn't tamper with it. So I drove the whole way across in Nebraska. This was hilarious. I'm driving this truck, and there was a car, nobody in Nebraska on the freeway back then, and this car was doing like 56 miles an hour, I'm going to say. So I wanted to pass this car, and I would drive, pushing on the accelerator, and if I get to 57, the governor would kick in, and it wouldn't kick back on until like 54. So I think I spent 30 minutes trying to pass this car, and I don't know why this lady didn't even look over at me, just sort of driving, and I was sort of like, I couldn't pass her because she was right on the edge of the governor, but I had nothing else to do, so I was like, okay, don't go too fast because it'll ruin you. But it was that was my trip across the country.
Oh.
Yeah, Adobe was not far from here. Well, actually, that's not true. They were on East Embarcadero. At that point, there were only, I think, 25 people in the company. So.
But you were the 25th employee, right?
No, my employee number was 40, but some people had come and gone. So or they didn't start at 1. I'm not quite sure how that worked, but there were about 25 people actually working there. So. So yeah, sometimes I say I was the 25th employee because nobody's going to call me on it, but technically it was number 40.
Still pretty early.
Yeah. And at the time, so I did come out to interview before I moved out there and before they gave me the offer, and this was kind of a memorable experience. I ended up working in the font technology team, but Sumner Stone, who ran that group, was in the hospital having some organ removed or something. And their policy at that time was you had to interview everyone in the company. So they drove me over to Stanford Hospital to talk to Sumner because he was going to be my boss's boss, which at the time I didn't know, I'm just a kid basically. But I was like, really? You're taking me to the hospital to talk to someone? And it was a harrowing experience, that interview, because, these were PhD computer scientists, sort of legendary in retrospect, and I didn't really know who they were. Like Chuck Geschke, who was the co-founder, I remember when I was sitting across from him, I was like, so what do you do here? And he's like, I'm the president. Like, I knew that, But they hired me anyway. But they were on East Embarcadero, 1870, I'm pretty sure. They were upstairs in a smallish building, and I think Ricoh Printing was downstairs or something. It was a big day when we grew enough to take over the downstairs and have the whole building. So we went from 25 people to 50 people the first year. We sort of doubled every year for the first few, and I worked there for probably four and a half years. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself, but are we still back in me getting my first job?
No, I want to hear all about. So like, so you initially were in marketing or?
No, I was on the font technical team because Liz Bond luckily realized that I was not a marketing person. I was a programmer, so she kind of handed me off to the woman who's my boss was basically my age, and Linda Gass. She ran the font technology group, and it's funny, we couldn't have been any more different. She grew up in Beverly Hills, which I didn't even know you could grow up in Beverly Hills. She went to Stanford and got her degree, so she was very smart and very precise, and I was sort of a gunslinger at that point, and I made her crazy because I didn't stay inside the lines very well, but it was weird, like I was her first employee and she was my first boss kind of thing, so, and we were maybe the two youngest people in the company, so it was kind of an unusual situation. Most of the people were in their 40s and 50s, which is unusual for a startup, but they weren't really a startup because they were the subsidiary of Xerox that Xerox didn't want. You know, they all left Xerox to start the company, so they were kind of big company people. Just, I don't even think the word startup existed then. It's like, no, we're doing this and we're starting a company. But it wasn't sort of like two co-founders and a lot of coffee. Like, you know, it was a very grown-up. They had HR and everything, and it didn't feel like a startup, but 25 people kind of is a startup. So, but yeah, there's sort of one person could be an entire department in a company that size. So I did, and you know, I lived in an apartment in Palo Alto by myself, and you go home from work and you realize there's nothing to do. So I would go back to work because they had great computers and stuff, and basically just stayed at work all the time. And I got interested. I was sort of a Unix person because that's what we did in college, and I was doing system administration and email hacking and UUCP stuff, and that drove Linda crazy because I wasn't working on font stuff, but I was kind of felt like my time between 8 and 11 p.m., you know, instead of being in my apartment. But at some point well, I won't blame this on her, but I think she complained about me, like, I don't know what to do with Glenn. He's all over the place. And so Chuck Geschke called me into his office one day after about a year and said, Glenn, you know, what was her name? I'll think of it in a second, but the woman who was running marketing basically says, you know, she wants you to work for her. And I was like, well, that's kind of random, and I don't really want it. But I came back the next day and says, I don't think I actually want to do that. I like it where I am. He goes, I think you should think about it again. You know, so they basically just yanked me out of the technical crew and put me in essentially developer support, which was part of marketing at that point. And the very next day, literally, there was a message to all Adobe, which was maybe 50 people, saying, you know, congratulations to this woman whose name I will remember a few minutes from now, who's going to be moving to Boston to open our Boston office. Like, so I think they just needed somebody to kind of hold the fort when she moved, and they're just like, we'll just move Glenn, but they didn't really take my point of view into consideration. So I ended up being in developer support. There was one other guy, maybe two people, and we had no boss, so it wasn't clear what to do. And a few weeks later, we went to this meeting, and there was a woman running the meeting who none of us had seen before. And it turned out she was our new manager, but nobody told us that, and nobody told her that we didn't know that. So we're like, who is this person? Why is she leading this meeting? You know, it wasn't handled particularly well, but she became maybe the best manager I ever had, and sort of still a good friend of mine all these years later. And it is notable as I tell this story that a lot of the managers in my path were female, which today is even rarely the case, but back in 1985, that was surprising. I wasn't surprised by it then because I didn't know any different, but looking back, I am. But she was a great manager because she understood management. She says, my job is to remove roadblocks so you can do your work, and she was amazing that way. But I didn't really want to be in developer support and marketing, so I became disgruntled, and I was like, how do I get out of this? And I didn't really want to talk to developers and help them write PostScript code. I was like, I'm not doing that. So people would call in, and I didn't answer the phone, and the pink slips would pile up. And I figured if they call back 3 or 4 times, then maybe they still have a problem. But a lot of people solve their own problem, and those pink slips would go into the trash. But I just started writing technical documentation as my way of, A, supporting these people. I'm like, I'm going to write it down and send it to you. And B, it was like, I started just putting my name on everything. Glenn Reid, Glenn Reid, Glenn Reid. So I knew deep down that would be it would help me get exposure outside the company. And it worked a lot better than I thought because Adobe was taking off, and all the tech doc that came out of Adobe was me, basically. And I remember going to this conference in Nashville, I don't know, it was probably maybe 25 at that point. And I was, giving this big speech to a room full of people on PostScript and didn't think anything of it, but people came up to me afterwards like, you're Glenn Reid? I'm like, yeah. You're a lot younger than I expected you to be. But, the guys that started the company, John Warnock, Chuck Geschke, they created the PostScript programming language, but they weren't very good at programming it. I came to realize and they were busy running a company, so I think I was probably the best PostScript programmer in the world for a few years because I spent all day doing that and writing about it, and I ended up writing a book. There were 3 books, the blue, red, and green book, and the red book was just a reference manual. The blue book, the cookbook, was dumb. It was like little Hello World programs. But there wasn't any sort of hardcore how to write real software in PostScript book, so I wrote that book, and it's still in print. You can still buy it on Amazon 30 years later. But
so you wrote that while you were...
Yeah, I asked my wonderful boss, I'm like, can I just write a book? She's like, I guess so,
And you were already writing these tech reports, so you figured you might as well just make it into a book?
Well,
or how did that...
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure where the idea came from, but there were 2 books already, and I realized they were inadequate. They didn't really tell you how to do all the things people needed to do. Mm-hmm. And the whole point of PostScript was printer drivers, so these were in the back end of some desktop publishing apps. But trying to get things to happen and manage memory and handle page breaks and whatever was fairly difficult to do. And there was really nothing anywhere written down that helped you. So it was seeing the problems that people had and realizing, I can tell you how to do that, but I'm going to do it in book form. And my brother's typesetting thing was called Scribe, and it was a markup language. You would, he used @ signs, so @I was italic and @B was bold.
Oh, so he had created this language.
Yeah, that was his thesis in college, and it led to SGML and HTML markup languages and all that stuff. But even though my brother wrote it, it was kind of a pain in the butt. And I asked if we could use FrameMaker, which was not out yet, but it was in beta. And Steve Kirsch was, I think, one of the Adobe people. Dan Mills, his roommate, worked there or something. So we got an alpha version of FrameMaker, and I bought got Adobe to buy me a Sun 1 workstation, which was amazing at the time. So I was like the first person who'd actually written anything real in FrameMaker, and it was a constant stream of feedback back to those guys and finding bugs and whatever. So they were very appreciative. And one Siebold conference, they had a picture of me up on the screen like, here's Glenn Reid, he wrote Adobe's book with our product. So I kind of put them on the map because they bragged about that. And it was a stress test, like, a 250-page book with index and table of contents and stuff. So, but it was a very cool product and did the job. So, but yeah, and that, but I'm still disgruntled. So I spent a year doing this stuff, but not really wanting to. And I knew a lot about PostScript, and I had watched. So Next was running alongside of us a few streets over. I didn't really know much about what they were doing, but they co-developed Display PostScript with Adobe. So there were 2 people at Adobe and 2 people at Next who just went into a room for a year and a half and built that. And so I was aware of that, and I wasn't involved in it exactly, but I kind of followed it a little bit. And so when I finally decided to leave Adobe, I still might have been the youngest person there, and they just weren't. I was full of ambition, and they just weren't giving me big things to do. And like I was bridling a little bit. So it's like, I guess I have to leave, even though I love it here, because they won't. They're like, Glenn, sit down and be quiet. Be a nice boy. So there were 2 companies that I identified. One was Sun, because James Gosling had developed sort of the competitor in a way to Display PostScript, NEWIS or News or whatever. Mm-hmm. And it was based on PostScript execution. It was their own clone, and so I figured I could contribute to that. And Next, basically all I knew was Unix and PostScript. So those Sun and Next were Unix and PostScript. So I was like, I'll try to work at those 2 places. So somehow I got to James Gosling and got an interview over there, and loved what they were doing. But I sort of felt like it was, I guess, I've always felt that you shouldn't bite the hand that feeds you. Don't compete with the company that you work for. So I felt like they were the bad guys in a way, because they were trying to do the same thing, but not with official Adobe PostScript. So I literally sent an email to Steve Jobs. I guessed at his email address. It wasn't hard, sjobs@next.com. And I was like, you don't know me, but I'm over here, and I think you should hire me. And I didn't hear back from him, but I got a call from somebody in their engineering group who offered to interview me. And I think I went to 2 or 3 or 4 interviews, and they had a policy that if anybody interviewed you, sort of gave you a thumbs down, blackball, if you will, then they wouldn't hire you, even if the other 9 people liked you. So I was getting rejected, and basically they were like, you can't be a real engineer. You've worked in marketing, which sometimes is true, but I was like, but I got hijacked into marketing. But I came home from one of those rejection calls, and there was literally a message on my, tape-based answering machine. It was from Steve Jobs' admin, who I didn't know, but she said, Steve would like you to come in on Monday morning at 9 o'clock and talk to him. I'm like, okay. I'd never met the guy, or he never even responded to my email. So I showed up on Monday morning at 9 o'clock, and the receptionist could not have been any more dripping with condescension. She's like, the only name I had was Steve Jobs, and she's like, I doubt it. He's in his month or weekly staff meeting right now. I doubt if you have a meeting with him at 9 o'clock. I'm like, oh no, I got the wrong day, or I didn't know what was going on. But she's like, let me just call upstairs. So she called somewhere, and then she's like, yeah, go ahead up. So I went up these IM Pei designed stairs, I found out later, but the boardroom at Next was just all glass, and sure enough, there's Steve in there with, 15, 20 people having a meeting, and I thought, that's odd. And so I just sat down and didn't know what else to do. And he was famous for making you wait, so I think I sat there for 45 minutes. And then all of a sudden the door opened and they kind of beckoned me into the room. And Steve, who I'd never met before, but he was recognizable, he said, "Everybody, this is Glenn Reid, and he really wants to work here, so if you all like him, we're going to hire him." And here I am standing in the doorway still, and these people kind of turn in their chairs and look at me, and they basically interviewed me, for the next 10 minutes. I'm just standing there fielding questions, and I'm a fairly unflappable person, and reasonably good on my feet, but one of the things that happened was the fact that I'd written this book came up, and Steve, who's really good at sniffing out people who are full of crap, he's like, looked at his team, he's like, "Has anybody read it? Is it any good?" And this guy, Eric Zocker, who I didn't know, who ran their developer support, he piped up and said, "That's one of the best technical books I've ever read, blah, blah, blah." And he gave me an endorsement for my book, which probably got me the job. But I didn't know, the meeting just sort of ended, and I'm still in the doorway, so I left. And they ended up making me an offer, and I was in marketing, of course, but nobody knew exactly what I was supposed to do, including me. And Steve was acting VP of marketing, so technically I reported to him, but also to John Eisen, who basically hired me. But nobody knew what I was supposed to do, so I just kind of made up my own job description. And at that point in history, the T-shirts at Next said, the 80s, personal computing, the 90s, interpersonal computing. So I declared myself to be the product manager for interpersonal computing and printed it on my business cards, and nobody told me I couldn't and stuff. So, and I didn't really know what a product manager was or what interpersonal computing was, but they had the Ethernet and nobody else did, and so they were trying to make that more of a workflow thing and had a network-based printer. And Sun was doing the same thing with the network is the computer, but it was pretty new, and it was pretty unclear exactly what that meant, mounting remote file systems and all that stuff. So, but that's what Unix and workstations were good at. So that was my job for a while, and I should probably shut up and let you ask the next question.
No, that's all great. So let me take a step back. There are a couple questions I have about Adobe actually still. One was, so when you were in font technology, what specifically did you do? Or what things did you work on?
So the biggest thing that I did, there was a lot of little stuff, but fonts sort of didn't really exist yet. So, and there were two kinds of fonts. There were the ones that were in the printer that were PostScript fonts, Type 1 fonts and outline fonts that, drew the characters. And then there were screen fonts on your Mac that had to kind of look like what you were typing in was in Times Roman or whatever. So Apple had some number of built-in fonts, but no one had ever created third-party fonts before. So they needed me to take these new fonts that Adobe was developing for the laser writer and make the screen fonts for them such that they were manufacturable as a product, and also be able to download fonts into the laser writer, which wasn't possible before that. So two of the hardest things that you could possibly dream up that luckily I didn't know how hard they were or would have given up, but the screen fonts were poorly documented at best by Apple, sort of, here's what the structure looks like in memory, have fun with that. But we had these files from, internal font tools at Adobe that described the bitmaps of the font, but not how to turn them into screen fonts for the Mac. So I was writing programs, Unix programs that would take this raw data, create a binary thing that was supposed to be a screen font, transfer it over the serial cable into the Mac, and see if it worked. And if it didn't work, the Mac would just freeze up. There was no way to debug it. It would just like not do anything. You'd have to reboot it. So I spent, some number of months trying things, frozen screen, trying things, frozen screen. Somewhere about halfway through that, I came to understand that the byte order was different on the VAX than it was on the Macintosh, so we had to byte swap everything. But it was pretty gnarly, low-level, bit-level stuff. Every bit had to be in the right place, and I'm using, OD on Unix is octal dump, so, I'm combing through octal binary code, looking for which bits are off such that they'll work as screen fonts, and nobody's helping me or even knowing what I'm doing. They're like, is it done yet? That was the help I got.
So
and
you're using a program that generates the screen fonts
yeah, we had
from the outline?
these weren't outline fonts. These were bitmap screen fonts. So
you had the bitmap,
I had
Unix.
Unix text file that was, zeros and ones basically of where the pixels were supposed to be.
Okay, for every size.
Right.
Okay.
So there's 8 point, 10 point, 12 point. And so I'm writing a program that read these files in and created a binary file that was supposed to be a screen font.
Okay, that worked on the Mac.
Right.
Okay.
But it was all Unix VAX-based software. A lot of it was awk scripts and crazy shell script kind of things, and maybe a little C code here and there.
So you didn't design the font, like
Right.
somebody had already designed what the font looked like, but
Right.
you had to take
Right.
that from and make it into an actual file that would work on the Mac.
Exactly. And they had bitmap editors and font designers who were doing that stuff. Mostly on Sun workstations, on homebrew stuff, but some point in the middle there, they did have a Mac-based editor, but I think that was later because then they didn't need the stuff that I wrote. But so that was a big part of it. It was just getting these screen fonts to work at all. And then the other part was the font downloader, which was Apple Talk network.
Right.
So it was a Mac application, written in C, Consular C maybe. And luckily, the guy in the office next to me, Mike Schuster, was the best Mac programmer in the world at that point. He wrote Illustrator 1.0, but he was a little bit assuming that I knew. He's like, here, use this. And so he gave me sort of this Apple Talk core piece of code, but not much beyond that. So I had to figure out how to open a connection to the printer, download the fonts, and sort of make it not crash and all that stuff. And
So you're downloading the PostScript outline fonts to the
Right.
printer? Okay.
right. And that was straightforward from a PostScript point of view, but not straightforward from a Mac app with Apple Talk in 1985, or 86. So that was moderately difficult too. And at the end of the day, all of that stuff went into a box and was shrink wrapped and was called an Adobe downloadable font. So you would buy it, and you would put the little floppy disk in, and it would install the screen fonts in your Mac, and it would download the other fonts into your printer, and you could actually print them. And one of your colleagues, I forget who, I corresponded with on LinkedIn, and I still have serial number 1 of Adobe Souvenir font in a shrink wrap thing, and he's like, if you find it, we want it. And I think I know where it is, so at some point I'll give that to you guys. But yeah, I took the first one off the production line because why not?
Nice.
But it's lucky it still exists because, as I said earlier, I'm not that sentimental about that stuff.
Right. So going back to Next, so you were head of interpersonal computing. You were the product manager of interpersonal computing, which was basically about connecting Next boxes together with Ethernet.
Yeah, they were already doing that to some extent. I mean, I ended up working on email, and I got fax built into the operating system, which was vaguely in that category, but I had
So
to
just
kind of
adding networking applications to
kind
the
of, yeah, just
OS.
useful things that layered on top of, because the network was already there, but there wasn't a whole lot you could do with it yet, and I didn't do anything all that useful. It was sort of a pointless job, and at some point Steve figured that out. But I guess the one noteworthy thing I did was get fax built in, which was kind of cool in retrospect. So fax is, I guess it still exists. It's basically a image compression scheme, and you transmit it over a phone line. So I guess I kind of shepherded this. I didn't do the programming, but built it into the print panel. So when you were going to print a document, one of the things you could do was choose your modem and type in a phone number, and it would fax it to somebody instead of actually printing it, because we just had to make it, compress it into the CCIT group 4, so whatever the compression scheme was, and send it. And that was kind of useful at that point in history, because people still wanted you to send them faxes. And we also figured out how to get incoming faxes translated into TIFF files and sent to you as an email, essentially. So it was kind of the first digital fax machine, I guess you'd say. Nowadays, when people ask me for my fax number, I say, fax? What is that? But about 9 months in, Steve called me into his office one day. He's like, I don't think this is working out. What you're doing doesn't make any sense. Paraphrasing, I don't remember exactly what he said. But he says, the technical documentation team would love to have you, because I'd written a book, and the developer support team wants you. Be sort of, firing me almost, or putting me out to pasture is how I saw it. So he's like, why don't you think about it and let me know what you want to do? And I thought about it overnight, and I came back and said, I don't want to do any of that stuff. I'm getting further and further away from being an engineer. I'm going to quit, and I'm going to build applications for Next computers, because that's what you guys need more than anything. And he was sort of surprised by that, but he's like, all right, if you want to come back, you can come back, but if you want to do that, you can do that. So I went home and didn't have anybody to answer to, so I didn't have to say, I quit my job. But I sort of started what I did was I bought a Next machine at developer prices, which was crazy, $9,000. And I started writing software, and I ended up building an app called TouchType, which was a visual typesetting tool for kerning and moving letters around. It's pretty cool. And created a company called Right Brain Software and tried to make apps for Next machines. And I made probably 6 or 7 apps.
Oh, wow.
A few little utilities. Some of them were pretty amazing in retrospect. Like one was called Right Brain Rulers, and it gave you 2 little windows. One was horizontal, one was vertical, but they'd float above everything else, and you could move them around and like measure stuff on your screen. One was a screensaver. One was just kind of random utilities. But I also wrote a page layout app, which was a pretty big endeavor, and sort of won awards and got featured in, Next World magazine. And what I didn't quite realize was they weren't really selling any machines. There was no market out there to speak of, and I don't know who estimates that, 20, 30,000 machines maybe total, who knows, but not enough to really sustain a business. So it was fun, and I got to feel like a big fish in a small pond for a while. But I was losing money, and I am proud
The company
of that.
was just you?
It was just me. And at one point, I hired a couple people part-time and stuff, but actually, Eric Lee, who was the technical co-founder of LinkedIn, he was the first CTO there. He was still a student at Stanford, and I don't know how I found him, but I had him working for me part-time writing code. which he doesn't admit to now. It's not on his LinkedIn profile, but we're still friends and everything. He's a brilliant guy. But just that level of like dabbling with employees, but we never had more than 3 people in the office, I don't think.
But you were doing most of the technical work.
Yeah, most of it. And the page layout app, I'm still kind of proud of this.
That was called, what was it called?
Paste Up.
Paste Up, okay.
And I used a lot of apps at that point, and, Adobe, well, I supported, PageMaker and Quark Express and all, so I knew the landscape. And I also knew that they were all very rigid, and you couldn't rotate text in most of them and that kind of stuff. But I built what I believe is the world's only object-oriented text engine. So the way text works in almost every app in the world is, it's characters. You type E, F, T, whatever. When you backspace, you delete one. But most of the job of a page layout app is to flow text into columns and link it to the next page and all that stuff. So the letters end up being kind of beside the point. Once you've typed in a word, it stays as a word for the rest of its life unless you delete it or whatever. So what I realized was it's a word-based thing. It's not a character-based thing. So a word was an object, and when you're typing, you're just creating a word. When you're done, it was literally an object, and your object, what the app did was place the words and space them out to make the margins or whatever. And if you stuck the cursor in the middle, it would split it into 2 words. And I'm not sure it was a good idea because there's so many special cases about hyphenated words at the end of the line. Had to make a temporary word and then put it back together later. But it was a pretty interesting idea, and it was a lot faster than trying to lay it out character at a time. And at the end of the day, like my teenage daughter would have said, no one cares. Like, no one cares. Like, no one did care, and very few people bought it. So at some point, I realized I wasn't going to be able to sustain that anymore. But there was a thing that happened with Next was a bit of a cult in a way, sort of the cult of Steve Jobs. And Next was going through, they tried publishing and graphics, and Steve was on the cover of Publish magazine, the greatest computer for publishing ever made, which it was. It had display PostScript and fonts and everything, but they couldn't sell any of them. And what they found was they were selling machines to the CIA and people who wanted the development. They called it mission critical custom app development. So they started selling the Next as a development tool to build your internal apps at Big Co or CIA. CIA, I think, bought it because no one knew anything about it, so how are you going to hack it? So that, like, we want obscurity, but nothing interested me less than mission-critical custom business apps for, fertilizer companies or whatever. So I made the choice not to follow Next down that path. And I basically called somebody at Adobe and said, can I come back, please? And they said yes. So I went through that bumpy ride through Next and whatever. But what I had done was convinced people that I was actually a programmer by creating products that were good. So I got to get out of marketing at that point. And so I ended up working on Adobe Illustrator and helped get 5.5 and 6.0 out the door.
Let me go back a little bit. So back to the interpersonal computing. Wasn't that just like a Steve Jobs marketing term for something that Xerox had already invented?
Yeah, but Xerox didn't have it on the market. Like they didn't. Well, I guess you could maybe buy a Star or whatever, but you couldn't go out and buy that from anybody. Sun was a lot closer to it than Xerox was in terms of productization. But it was marketing, and it was kind of meaningless, but he foresaw, distributed network stuff being more valuable than just someone sitting at a personal workstation and typing stuff in. So, but definitely just a marketing thing. And as you know, the World Wide Web was first prototyped on a Next computer because it had all the network plumbing already built into it. But that came after I was gone, the Tim Berners-Lee and all that. But definitely text and graphics and networking, it was a real workstation. And Sun was getting pretty big at that point, but it was an engineering workstation. Regular people never owned a Sun. So Next was trying to disguise a Unix workstation as a personal computer and make it usable, which I think they succeeded in, whereas Sun and SGI and all those companies and DEC never got through that. It was just engineers who had those workstations. Right. And as we now know, that became Mac OS X, so it eventually became real.
Yeah. But you find it fascinating, though, that, like, at the time, it was the workstation computers makers were succeeding because they had a target market. They had a market that could actually afford to buy $10,000 machines, whereas Next was trying to sell $10,000 machines to
mom and pop typesetting shops or whoever.
Who weren't going to be able to afford that kind of a thing.
And they were not successful in doing that. And that's why they pivoted into corporate sales and custom development and whatever. And they weren't successful at that either. Right.
But you mentioned, like, the cult-like thing, and also, the fact that, like, you mentioned that it seemed like nobody cared, but at least Next World and the people who were writing about, who were trying to maintain the enthusiasm for a vibrant third-party app ecosystem.
Right.
Like your apps were really well received, at least critically.
Yeah, and they were, it was just always a small pond. They did everything trying to create the next Mac, more or less, and they had all the right pieces in place. It never scaled, and I think mostly it's just too expensive, If they could have sold it at prices that were competitive with Windows PCs, and Macs were even too expensive at that point. But they worked great. It was compelling. They built the ecosystem with Steve's money. I'm sure he funded Next World magazine and just tried to he wanted to create the next Mac because they kicked him out of there and whatever. So he did all the things to do that, except it just didn't quite get there. And it's possible it would have if he'd stuck at it longer, but maybe not. Like you say, $10,000, nobody was spending that for a PC. And somebody told me once that what Americans want is the cheapest thing that's good enough. And that really stuck with me because I think it's true. Like, there's some line where what is good enough and what is cheap, but they don't really want the best thing, most of us, And that was a Windows PC was the cheapest thing that was good enough. And it wasn't as good as the Mac, but it was a lot cheaper. So for a long time, the Mac was not successful either because it was more expensive than the PC. And you could get a lot of the same apps. And, like, yeah, it's cooler and sexier, but it's not that. I don't need all that stuff. It's good enough, So the quest for greatness doesn't really work. I mean, Steve tried to brute force that onto the world and mostly failed. And I believe when he got back to Apple, if you look through the history of it carefully, he never was really successful. The Mac, he didn't stick around long enough. Next was not successful. But when Next bought Apple for a negative $400 million, he suddenly had this company that, Jean-Louis Gasset and whoever had grown into a big company and had a big bank account. And, there are some stories in history of like Adidas and Tommy Hilfiger, these forgotten brands where somebody comes along and buys the brand and dumps a couple $100 million in advertising, and the brand takes off again. Like you can create a brand by just spending a lot of money. And that's what Steve did. He came back to Apple and poured hundreds of millions of dollars into marketing and created a new Mac and everything, but it wasn't that much better than the last Mac. But what I
More
think,
style than substance, you would say.
yeah, it was still a mediocre computer with a beautiful shell around it or whatever. But in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, automobiles had stopped evolving. In the very early days, they argued about should it have a tiller or a steering wheel, reins, how do you steer this thing? But in the middle years, it was just settling down to legroom and horsepower, and the ads were selling the number of cubic inches displacement of the engine, whatever. And the same thing happened with computers, where at that point in the late 80s, you were supposed to know what a megabyte and a gigabyte were and the dimensions of your screen. And what Steve did was change that into a lifestyle sale. In cars, nowadays you see a car ad for BMW or Mini, you almost don't even see the car, right? It's like the person who's about to get in the car and how cool they are. And so Apple's first ad campaign was sort of, this is the kind of person you're going to be if you have a Mac. It was,
right. I mean, think different.
It was a lifestyle sale. It wasn't a megahertz sale. And it was perfect timing where people were sick of trying to understand what was in a Mac or a PC. And, I'm a Mac, I'm a PC, like the whole thing. He was the first person to move computers into lifestyle sales instead of gigahertz sales, and it worked. But it wasn't that the products were better. And in a way, I think Apple is a fashion company starting at that point in history, where here's our secret collection that we're unveiling at the January Macworld and a big event. You might as well be Yves Saint Laurent at that point, And it was important that every season was different and sexier than the previous one. People love that stuff, but it has nothing to do with computers at that point. They have become a commodity where you want to be cool and have the cool computer, and that's why they're successful. It had nothing to do with genius or products or whatever. It's just straight up, hundreds of millions of dollars of marketing. And I built iMovie 1.0 at Apple. There's a good story behind that, but they hired Jeff Goldblum to do TV ads to advertise iMovie. Like, no one had ever advertised computers on TV before, much less with Jeff Goldblum. So that works, it just works. But it's a different path than most people think. It wasn't about the products. It was about changing the company to be more like Nike isn't about the shoes. It's a brand company. In fact, apparently they build and sell shoes that no one's ever even run around the block in. It's like they just do the 3D CAD and ship it. Like, they don't care if it's comfortable or performs well. But
yeah, before we get
getting ahead of myself, aren't I?
Before we get to the iMovie, so I still want to go back to the next software community. You mentioned you were a big fish in a small pond. It seemed like everybody knew everybody in that community, and was it close knit? Do you still keep in touch with those people?
Yeah, for his fault, Steve was an amazing judge of, I won't say character, but he could tell if you knew what you were doing or not. He was very good at sussing people out. So the people he hired and the people in that community were some of the best people in the world at that point, and they all kind of knew it, and it was a very close-knit community. And when Next got acquired, somebody formed the X-Next mailing list, which still exists, and it's sort of this feel-good sense of those were the good old days. Like, we had budget and we had smart people everywhere, and the extended community, all the third-party developers. It was people kind of realized how small the pond was, and it was kind of a great little bubble to be in for a while if you didn't worry about reality outside the bubble. And yeah, amazing people. And software, it's the most opaque profession I know of, where if somebody's sitting next to you all day long and typing stuff in, you have no idea what they're doing, even if you look at the source code or whatever. So people, no one appreciates whatever you do because, they just don't know. But it's also easy to lie and make up stuff, and that's going to take 6 months. So there's a ton of misinformation and bluffing and misrepresentation within the software industry. And I've noticed that the difference between a really good programmer and an okay programmer is at least a 10x multiplier, if not more. But it's sort of like the difference between Michael Jordan and the rest of the basketball players in the world. The really good people are just, they should have agents and should be paid tens of millions of dollars like basketball players. They just don't know it, so they take their, $200,000, this is great. But, they're single-handedly doing these things that make hundreds of millions of dollars, and they just need an agent, basically. But most of the amazing things that I know of were just one person, Adobe Illustrator, one guy, Photoshop, two guys, and you learn about these teams of 400 programmers. Like, what are you doing? They're constantly negotiating who's allowed to change a line of code instead of actually creating code. So there are a lot of superstars that people have no idea about because they were probably on the spectrum a little bit and didn't like people and didn't want to talk about it. But when you know some of those people, like, you're totally undervalued. Like, yeah, whatever, I like my job and I got a cool computer and a big monitor, so I'm good, But it's amazing how poorly we've cultivated our own technical talent in the Valley and elsewhere. I think people, if you did pay them $10 million, they might, like Mike Schuster created Illustrator. He really didn't do anything after that. He just kind of went to pasture in advanced technology. And it's a shame because he was phenomenal. And, somebody needed to light a match under him, like, Mike, go build something else, But he was off, doing whatever. Advanced technology is like pasture. There's good grass. Nobody has to actually ship anything. And, some people are compelled to keep doing stuff like me, and it's not a good path necessarily, but it's a compulsion. But I think it's you asked about that community, and it was full of people like that, like people who could single-handedly create one of my friends, William Parkhurst, was, he basically created the entire Objective-C toolkit for the Next operating system by himself, And who can do that? And he went on to do a lot of stuff at Microsoft and stuff, but it was amazing how many of those kinds of people were in that ecosystem.
Right. So how closely did you interact with them? Like,
with William?
No, with
the
people
people
in the community.
When I was actually
third-party developers
at Next, a fair amount. When I was in the third-party community, less so. You sort of see them around kind of thing. But we all sort of felt like we were part of the same weird hobby group, you know. But we stayed in touch largely through this mailing list, and you know, sometimes some of them were good friends, and others were just people you knew. And we have reunions every once in a while. And I didn't stay there for very long. I was only at the company for 9 months, but I was in the ecosystem for 3 or 4 years. But you know, some of those people worked at Next or Apple, then Next, then Apple again for 25 years, and they're much more Kool-Aid drinkers than I ever was. But
well, I mean I actually want to talk about the Kool-Aid because, and you mentioned William Parkhurst and creator of the AppKit. A lot there are some people in that started off in the Next software community that they were attracted to it because of the AppKit and because of how maybe easy it was to create an app using the AppKit, and how maybe how enjoyable it was, or how much better it was than what was out there at the time, and that sort of then some of them continued on in OS 10. What was it specifically about the AppKit and about the Next developer environment that was so compelling?
Interface builder. Mm-hmm. There were other ways to create the front ends of apps like ResEdit on the Mac, but interface builder was really good, and it and the underlying language Objective-C are loosely coupled. You can attach a button to the code at runtime. You don't have to sort of compile it in or whatever, and that just made it a lot easier. There's basically two kinds of software. There's front end and back end, if you will, so things that people interact with. Now, well, even back then, just buttons and sliders and all that stuff. And then there's just stuff that doesn't have people attached to it anywhere. Servers, or even just the internal algorithms that, when you're typing text into a text engine, that involves the user. Once you have that text, there's a lot of stuff that happens. So the user interfaces are difficult, and they always have been, and for a bunch of reasons. But one of them is that people keep changing their minds on what it should be and how it should look and all that stuff. And you just have to keep reprogramming the same thing over and over and over. It's tedious, and you're counting pixels and trying to figure out if the button's big enough for the text, and it's not that fun, and it's kind of important. If you do a bad job of it, that's people's user experience. So no programmer ever wants to do that stuff, but you have to. So Interface Builder was quite a bit better than all of the things that had come before it at that part of any task. It didn't matter whether it was, consumer software, or whether it was like the control panel for your modem. Like, you still have to put up the buttons and the text boxes. So the rest of it didn't matter. Like, Objective-C was weird, but it wasn't all that different than any other programming language. It was necessary to enable Interface Builder, that loose coupling, but it sort of didn't matter syntactically or whatever. And I don't think good programmers don't really care about the language. It's like, whatever it is, I'll figure it out. But if I don't have to, count pixels, I'm in, And, they did some interesting things like constraint-based layout. This button can be no bigger than that, no smaller than that, and that's much more prevalent now. In the old days, you knew what size the screen was. It was always 1024 by 768 or whatever, so you could kind of cheat and just stick it at 200 pixels in and 100 pixels down, and it's good. But mobile in particular really changed that. Like, you can't assume the screen size, or even while you're running, you can rotate the phone or whatever. So layout got a lot more complicated, and you basically can't do it without constraint-based systems. You have to create a bunch of rules for what happens when the screen gets small and big, and it's a nightmare. But Interface Builder was maybe the first construction kit that really addressed some of those issues and made it easy. And that's where custom app development came from. Like, that is where people spend all their time, is trying to get all that stuff in place. iMovie, no one knows this except now everyone knows this because I'm being recorded, but we had the same problem. Like, we were writing a C program to make movies. We actually had a fixed screen size because it shipped on the iMac, but there were a lot of cooks in the kitchen as to what the interface should look like. And this woman that I hired out of Fractal, Priscilla Shee, who's amazing, she and I came up with this scheme. Basically, we knew we'd have to keep reprogramming the interface. So we designed a Photoshop file format. We used the layers in Photoshop to represent, for example, a button. You have a mouse over state and a click state. They change colors a little bit. So those would be 4 layers in Photoshop. And we made up a little language in the Photoshop layer names, like this is the mouse over state, this is the click state, and we sort of recreated Interface Builder inside Photoshop files, if you will. And then we taught iMovie how to open and read in the Photoshop files to display the interface, because the artists were always changing the bits on us and we would have to keep redoing it. So we were able to give them the Photoshop file and say, change it all you want, just don't mess up the layer names because that's necessary. So, and we could read the entire, I think there were about 300 layers in the Photoshop file. And we could read the whole thing in and display it in half a second. So it was like a really good way to do user interfaces. And we decided to ship it that way. So built into the first 4 versions of iMovie was a Photoshop file where we changed the file type so you never knew it was a Photoshop file. And would just read it in, and that was your user interface. But if you knew that that was a Photoshop file, you could literally open it up in Photoshop, change it, and save it again, and iMovie would actually...
So you could skin iMovie if you knew that.
Yeah. And in fact, you could do it while iMovie was running because we needed that. So iMovie every 2 seconds, every 1 second would check the file modification time on this Photoshop file. And if it had changed, it would dump the UI and reload it. And so we could, in real time, play around with the user interface while the app was running and move the button and change the title on it and stuff. And it made it much easier for us to do our work, but we didn't really want people to be reskinning it and screwing around with it, so we just didn't tell anybody.
Fascinating. We'll get there, but I want to go back to, so right after you left Next, or not, so after Right Brain shut down, you went back to Adobe and you worked on, you managed the Illustrator team at that point?
At first I was just a team member, and then Joe Ternasky was kind of managing it, and Joe Holt was one of the, the lead programmers, I guess. So we were good friends, and nobody really cared who managed anything, and it was very egalitarian, sort of if you're good at what you do, it doesn't matter if you have a management hat on. Illustrator 5.5 was underway when I came back. That was when Apple was ditching the 68040 and moving to the PowerPC chip. So they called it 5.5 because they didn't want to do any new features. It was just a port to the PowerPC. But I was like an unnecessary team member because I just parachuted in out of the blue and knew the founder, so they just let me come work there.
Oh, so they let you choose where to go?
Well, it's hard to describe, but it's sort of like if you just went back to your childhood. It was super informal. Nobody, or for me it was, because I was an early employee, so I got to cheat a little bit, I guess. And so they didn't know what to do with me. It was just like, I guess Glenn's on our team now. And I was like, well, how about I make features, because you guys already have the rest of this going. So I contributed all of the features in Illustrator 5.5, which were small things, but I guess we built a plugin interface. So Photoshop had plugins, Illustrator did not, but we built that as a way to add features such that it wouldn't impact the critical path of the main app. Like, they were nervous about hacking the code base, so we built the plugin interface was so good that they eventually migrated all of the features in Illustrator to be plugins that loaded at runtime, so you can actually adjust the feature set of Illustrator by mucking around in the plugins folder. But I built, a spell checker. I added tabs to the text engine. There were 4 or 5 features. They weren't big features, but they were useful, and nobody else was building features because that wasn't the point of that release. So, and then I stayed on, and I guess I did manage the Illustrator 6 team for a while. But it got weird, where in a company there were probably a couple thousand people there at that point, and company politics can be a real thing, and internal fighting teams, and just there was a lot too much of that. And Adobe, the founders were too nice. Like, as long as things were basically going fine, they didn't get involved in, it's sort of like if your kids are fighting and you just shut the door. There was that kind of a thing. Like, they can fight in the basement, and we're not going to intervene. And that was kind of toxic in retrospect. Like, people take advantage of that, and the assholes start to come out of the woodwork and realize that their parents aren't going to yell at them, so they can make a power play and make that guy wrong about something. And there was a lot of that stuff going on that shouldn't have been. And in every company that's true, but some companies, the leadership is a little more unforgiving of that sort of stuff. And Steve Jobs accidentally, part of his thing was he just wanted to know who was doing all the real work. Like, so he would skip over all the layers of management and go find the person who was building the new display and just show up in their office and ask him how it was going. And if you asked the director, asked the vice president, to ask the manager, you'd have a meeting 3 weeks from now, which was carefully staged, and it would basically be fiction, And he knew that, so he'd just go find the person. And so he knew a lot more about what was actually going on than most CEOs, and was relatively intolerant. So there was very little of that type of stuff in his organizations, but it tends to be rampant in a lot of other organizations. And Adobe got pretty mired in internal conflict for a lot of years. So that's more or less why I ended up leaving the second time, was just too messy.
So you were, the second time at Adobe was what years?
Let's see. It was about the mid-90s, so it was probably 95, 96. Yeah, I think that's right.
And you were there for how long?
It was about 2 years, I think, and there was a kind of a crazy way in which I left. So there was sort of an internal war on the Illustrator team about how things should go, and somebody was trying to rewrite the whole text engine, and it just wasn't good. And I and the 2 Joes, we were all kind of trying to navigate that whole thing. And my manager, Joe Ternasky's like, I think I said, I'm just leaving. I'm sick of this. And he's like, I'm leaving too. And he said, I've already got this job lined up at Fractal Design. They were down in Aptos. He goes, you should come with me. And then the other Joe, Holt, he's like, I'm coming too. So the 3 of us were like, let's just all leave and go work at Fractal. And Fractal couldn't believe their good fortune that like this core team from Adobe was going to all come and work there. And so that was sort of happening. And Joe Chernowski was going to be the VP of engineering. And Fractal was created by these nutty professor types who had built a competitor to Photoshop that was good called Painter. And they were always sort of disgruntled and they didn't get to win because Photoshop won, but brilliant guys, but very poor human being skills. So they were trying to get investors and go public. And they're like, you guys can't both run this company and write all the code, like that doesn't scale. So they were trying to hire Joe just to be the VP of marketing to solve that problem. But so Joe signed an offer and we all three went down there and interviewed and it was all good. And then when Joe went to Adobe to quit, they wouldn't let him leave. They promoted him to director and he ended up, I think he had 2 signed offer letters, some other company and Fractal, and he ended up just staying at Adobe. They talked him into staying. And then Joe Holt is like, yeah, I guess I'm staying too. I'm like, that kind of leaves me hanging out here. But so I went back to Fractal and said, how about you give me the VP job and those other 2 guys aren't coming. And they were completely mystified, but they agreed to it. And like, okay. So I just suddenly worked at Fractal instead of Adobe at that point.
So you became the head of marketing at Fractal?
Head of engineering.
Oh, head of engineering, okay.
Yeah. That was quite a journey. So Mark Zimmer and Tom Hedges, they were like the odd couple. They sat, at desks about 4 feet apart and just yelled at each other all day long and copied files. And they didn't use source code control or anything grown up. And programmers were quitting left and right. They just couldn't get in the middle of this mind meld of these 2 guys. So my job was to fix that. I was like, and I don't know if my people skills are strong or whatever, but I wasn't afraid of them. I was like, what are you guys doing? Like we're using source code. I just like forced them to grow up and like they would literally have a programmer working on something for a week and then they would just copy their file on top of theirs so the programmer lost all their work. And they'd just be like, well, do it again. Like they just didn't care. And so the person would quit, And it's like, there's better ways to do this. You can do this source code control stuff. So I kind of forced actual organization and engineering management practices onto the company.
How many programmers or developers were there?
5 maybe.
Okay.
Besides the founders, but it was a bit of a rotating pool. And I was there for a while, but it was a mess. And I met my wife there, and I met Priscilla there, who I eventually brought back to Apple for the iMovie team. But I left there after a couple of years, not to go anywhere, but my wife and I had a baby, and it's like, I'm just going to stay home and be there for her, and did consulting and stuff. So I got to be there when she was taking her first steps and all that. And of course, she doesn't remember that or value me for having been there. So, but I was glad.
So you were at Fractal for which years?
So my daughter was born in 96. So I was probably there 95 and 96. And yeah, so then I just was home for a year and a half or so. And I did odd things like, do you know about Ghost Script? So,
oh, yeah.
Peter Deutsch had this little company called Aladdin Systems, I think. Then they basically, he wasn't really involved. He was kind of involved, but this other guy, Miles, somebody.
This is Peter Deutsch, who had been at Park?
Yeah. So he created Ghost Script as a pet project, and there was a company, sort of like, it was early open source, but there was a company that would manage it, sort of like Red Hat manages Linux. So this company would charge you money to help you use GhostScript in your business or whatever. And so I consulted for those guys and kind of worked remotely from home and hung out with my family. And
GhostScript is basically a third-party PostScript interpreter. Is that
yeah,
right?
it's a little bit like Image Magic, if you're familiar with that, with ICK. It's sort of a command line interpreter that would. It had a full PostScript rendering thing and everything, but you sort of would use it to convert a file or print it or whatever. Sort of a utility thing that mostly ran on Unix and Linux systems. Fairly obscure, but if it solved a problem you had, and people would run it in print shops to accomplish weird things, but it never was very mainstream. But Peter Deutsch was a brilliant guy, so it was a fairly good implementation of a PostScript interpreter. It struggled with things like proprietary Adobe fonts and that sort of thing. That's where a lot of the clones had trouble with. The execution of the language was fairly straightforward, but all the ancillary stuff where it hit commercial products got messy, and fonts in particular. But yeah, I just was kind of just staying home. And that's how I ended up at Apple. Was during that time, Next bought Apple for negative $400 million, as I like to put it. And they were trying to instill Next Step as OS 10 into a company that didn't really want it. And, because if you had spent decades on Mac OS, you suddenly weren't an expert anymore. You didn't know anything about it. So they had to come and find people like me who knew about Next Step and all that. So Steve's sort of right-hand man, Sina Tamadone, who's at the time his business card just said Office of the CEO. And he's a very nice, mild-mannered guy, but basically he was the hatchet man. So Steve would be like, Sina, go get rid of the Newton division. Sina, delete half the product line. Sina, fix service and support. And Sina would just go do it. So he was, at that time...
Did he come from Next also?
Yeah, he was originally field sales in Chicago, and he was part of the team that, part of Steve's inner trusted circle, I guess, but very off the radar. He didn't really like any kind of publicity. It was still hard to find any information about him, but and he was trying to fix service and support at that point in history. So, but Apple in 1996-ish, just post-acquisition of Next, was at a crossroads in history where Apple was almost dead. And people like Sun were making, I think Sun was still around, but the idea of a netbook or a network operating system where you don't need a hard drive so much anymore, the network's fast enough you can have distributed storage, like that was kind of catching hold, and it fizzled out and came back much later. But Steve was sort of worried about that. Like Mac OS, which they still shipped for a while, but while they were trying to get OS 10 working on a Mac, they didn't do that stuff very well. Like Mac OS was not good at network file systems or any of that stuff. So he was basically like, we need a reason for you to need a hard drive when the rest of the world thinks maybe you don't. And basically he's like, we need a movie app so it'll fill up your hard drive so that you'll want a bigger hard drive and you'll buy a Mac. And nobody'd really done video editing without custom hardware and boards, and it was sort of a propeller head profession at that point. So it was like, give me an easy-to-use video editor that will run on a Mac without external hardware and make people want to buy a Mac, was sort of the impetus for it. And he sort of just told Sina, like, go find Glenn Reid. He can probably build that. So Sina called me up, and it's like, I was having none of it. Like, I don't want to go work at Apple. Apple's almost dead, and I don't care, and I'm fine over here. And quit bugging me. So he, he tried for months to hire me, and I was having none of it. But eventually, he wore me down, and it was like the best red carpet project ever, where they just sort of like, how can I put this? They're like, how about you just come in here and you don't have to deal with anybody, and you just go build an app for us and we'll pay you well. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll do that. And at that point, Steve was obsessed with secrecy and remained so, but nobody got to know what I was working on, including the people from Final Cut team who allegedly were in the same group. Like, they couldn't see it. It made them mad. And there was no apps division at Apple, so we all reported to the VP of Service and Support, and because that was what Cena was at the time. And they put us in the hallway near Steve's office on the third floor of aisle 1, right by the tax accounting group. Like, it was not an engineering thing, but he just wanted us close so he could yell at us, kind of thing.
But Apple already owned Final Cut at this point also.
Yeah, so that's a whole nother story. But so Randy Ubilos had built Adobe Premiere, and as one of his programmers put it once, Randy codes like a pig. It was a very weirdly written app, but he left Adobe to compete with Adobe, to bite the hand that feeds him, if you will. So he went to Macromedia to build a competitor to Premiere, which became Final Cut. But they couldn't finish it. During my consulting years, I even went and worked on that app for a little while. And it was just, they just kept moving the goalposts. I think they worked on it for 5, 6, 7 years, and we're no closer to shipping it than, it was a huge, messy project. I think what happened was Steve bought the app from Macromedia, who didn't want it anymore because it was not going well, and thought that would be iMovie. Like, oh, they're building a video app. But they couldn't finish it. It was a mess. And he got frustrated with them and hired me to go build it. And they renamed it Final Cut Pro. Originally, iMovie was going to be called Final Cut, and that was going to be Final Cut Pro. And then at the end of that road, they decided to call it iMovie. But Randy never liked me because I was the guy who came in and did in 9 months what he couldn't do in 6 years. And I did it with 2 people instead of 20. And eventually, he stayed, and he eventually deleted my version and stuck his in place of it. But I wasn't, there was paper on the windows of my office on the interior hallway, like that window right there type of thing. So there was that level of secrecy. But it was a pretty great thing, and there was no product marketing. There was no anything. It was not a division. Like, we hired some QA people, but it was just a blank whiteboard, and my product manager was Steve. Like, he would come in and scribble on the whiteboard and go away, and I would try to interpret it and build something, and he would tell me how it sucked and whatever. But there was nobody else in the loop. There were maybe 5 people that even knew it was happening. And at this point, so the first iMac, the Bondi Blue, when that machine shipped, Steve didn't tell the VP of sales at Apple that he was developing the iMac because he knew that he would tell somebody. So he developed an entirely new computer and pushed it into manufacturing without telling the VP of sales at his own VP of sales, because he didn't trust him not to leak it, essentially. And he literally read about it in the newspaper when they launched it. He's like, what? And he had to go back and revise. Like, he let him submit forecasts for Mac sales and all this stuff without knowing that there was an iMac in the pipeline. So it was that level of ridiculous secrecy. But that's kind of great if you're a programmer. Like, you don't have to deal with anybody. And Will Stein, who managed the Final Cut project, was a super nice guy. So I reported to him just so that I wouldn't be bugging Cena or anybody. And he loved his staff meetings, so he'd have these meetings with 10 people, and I hate staff meetings. And at one point I said, Will, I'm not allowed to tell anybody what I'm doing. I'm sitting here not reporting on my progress, and I don't care what they're doing. It's like, I'm not coming to your meetings anymore. He's like, what? I'm like, I'm wasting 2 hours a week sitting here, contributing nothing and learning nothing. And he was sort of mystified, but super nice guy. So I basically never went to meetings and never did anything except built product, and that's about as good as it gets as an engineer. So, and we did some amazing stuff. So there was a point when I'd been there for maybe 2 months, and if I'm getting too long-winded, you feel free to shut me up, but I hired Joe Holt, my buddy from Adobe, who's maybe one of the best programmers in the world, and Priscilla from Fractal, one of the other best programmers in the world. Basically, it was the three of us. I'm like, all right, here we go. And a month or two into it, at this point in history, so iMovie shipped on Mac OS 9. OS 10 wasn't ready yet, so we had to get all that stuff to work. And the video layer on the Mac was QuickTime. And this was right about when DV cameras were just hitting the market from Sony and a few other vendors. But QuickTime didn't support DV. It was still analog and hardware translations, and they only had two ways to, well, they basically had video and audio separate. There were separate components. You would import them separately and put them together because they were just different and they were analog. So we're supposed to build iMovie on top of this and using DV. That was our only marching orders, is DV only, and it needs to not suck. So, but we couldn't do it. QuickTime didn't do what we needed to do. And Joe Holt, he's like, let me write to Sony, who had created the DV spec. I'll get the manual, which is like 3 inches thick tech spec for a DV. And he's like, I think I can just do this myself. So he recreated something that was better than QuickTime in about 2 months. And the way you imported movie footage back then was you hit the play button on the camera, and then it was coming into the FireWire port in real time, 30 frames a second, basically. And your job is not to miss any of those frames. They have to end up on the disk. And Adobe Premiere at that point in history, or all the apps that imported video, what they did was they turned off Apple Talk. They told you don't touch the mouse or the keyboard, and they would show this tiny little preview, and basically they were just trying to put it on the disk without missing anything and put the user interface in suspended animation so you wouldn't ruin it. And I was like, that's not a user experience anybody wants. So what Joe did was went and talked to the people who built FireWire hardware and like learned how it worked, and wrote his own interrupt level driver into OS that would read the frames coming in off of FireWire and write them to disk. And it was so bomb-proof that like your entire Mac could freeze up and the OS didn't work, but it was still capturing video and not missing any frames. And then he's like, each frame as it came in, he would write it into a memory buffer that could be read from the actual OS. So this was below the OS. And so what iMovie did was displayed whatever frame was in that little buffer that was being pushed up from the low level. And it didn't matter if you got all of them, except this was just a preview. So we were able to preview full size, full resolution, beautiful, and you could run your email app and be on the network because it was capturing the video reliably way down in the lower level. The rest of it was just interface stuff. So for years, I found out people who even used Final Cut used iMovie to capture their video just because it did such a better job than everything else that had ever come before it. And one day, I got called into Steve's office when we were about halfway done with that. And there was Phil Schiller and Tim Schaff, who ran the QuickTime team, and one other VP of some sort. And I didn't know why I was being summoned in there, but Steve said, "So I understand you're not using QuickTime, and that's a big fucking problem," he said. And I was like, okay. And he just stopped, and I was expected to explain myself. What I found out later was Phil Schiller basically had set me up trying to get me fired. Like, he thought that was the wrong thing to do, and the VP of QuickTime thought it was the wrong thing to do. And I said, well, that's true, we are doing that. And the reason is the QuickTime doesn't work yet, and we can't use it, and we need to make our schedule. And by the way, it's better than QuickTime. And
that went over well.
And Tim Schaff is a nice guy, actually, and I don't think he even knew exactly what we were doing. But Steve looks at him, he says, "Is that true that you can either import video or audio, but not both?" Which was the case. Like, it was coming at you so fast, you had to pick. And you can't pick. You needed them both. So, and to his credit, he told the truth. It's like, yeah, that's basically true. It doesn't work yet. And Steve was like, you know what I think? I think this guy deserves a fucking medal. And he just yelled for the next 5 minutes. And but he realized that we were getting it done in spite of the fact that the underlying substrate didn't work. And people don't realize that a consumer app like iMovie was maybe one of the most hardcore pieces of system software I've ever written, because to make it easy to use, you have to do some really hard work at low levels. And same thing in iPhoto, but far more hardcore than anything else I've built, except maybe that font download tool. But so I navigated through that, and at some point, a few weeks later, and so my boss Sina was in Europe at the time, so that was why they were trying to throw me under the bus. But I got called into the office of the VP of Human Resources at Apple, which is never a good thing. And it was a guy, I can't remember his name. The first thing he said was, "Don't worry." But they had a medal made for me that said fucking medal on it, and they did a little medal ceremony. So I think I'm the only person in the world who has a medal from Steve Jobs that says fucking medal on it. But and I have that hanging on my wall at my office in Milwaukee, and people love it. But you know, we didn't accept that it couldn't be done, and we just went and did it. And you know, the Final Cut team and most teams just use QuickTime as a scapegoat. Well, we can't ship this because we're waiting for the QuickTime team. And I was like, we have to ship this because Steve said it needs to be done in January, so we're not waiting for the QuickTime team. And Will, at some point, we finished iMovie in 9 months, which was pretty amazing. Mostly because we were allowed to not add features. Like, Steve didn't like complicated stuff, so we were just done. And I was like, all right, we're not changing it, we're not adding anything, we're just gonna wait for the hardware to be done, and we're gonna fix bugs. And Steve was like, great. Every other team in the world would add features at that point. But Will was like, who's my manager, he's like, how did you do that? I was like, do what? He's like, you shipped that ahead of schedule. I was like, yeah. He goes, I've never seen that happen before. I was like, I can tell, you know. But it's it's become a given that things take too long and are full of bugs, and it doesn't need to be that way. But for the most part, it is. So that was a very kind of pirate ship project, and it went well, but it could easily have not gone well. But, you know, Steve and I got along well, and part of the reason is I didn't take no for an answer, you know, and I've always built products such that they call it scoping, like how long is this going to take and what's it going to do. I scope things in such a way that if I was doing this all myself, I could do it in this amount of time. And then if I have help, that's great, but I know that I could see it end to end. Like, it needs to be that one person needs to be able to hold the entire thing in their head and say, I see how it's going to go. If it's a distributed thing, like, well, I know how this is going to work, and you know how that's going to work, and hopefully it'll all come together. It doesn't. So, and I think everyone on my teams, I encourage to be that, to have the full vision. Like, you're not over here doing that. We're all doing all of it, and we all need to be able to more or less believe that if the rest of us went home, you could finish it by yourself, kind of thing. It's still hard to get it done on time, but it is possible. Skipping ahead a teeny bit, I photo. Sometimes people ask me, like, what am I most proud of in my career? This is something I think maybe I'm the only person who even knows about, but I photoed two. A 1.0 product people notice and they write articles. The 2.0, nobody cares. So we added a few features, and they were on a yearly cycle from Macworld to Macworld Expo, basically. So we added some features, and we got it done. But we shipped 2.0 at Macworld January, although we had to finish it in November because it was baked on hard drives or whatever. So, but we fixed, all the bugs basically. Like, and iMovie, there were 6 known bugs when we shipped it, and some number that small like that. And Photoshop, when I was at Adobe, they would ship a version that had 6,000 known bugs. I was like, what? And most of the time, they don't even know if it's still a bug or not. Like, nobody's going to go back and retry 6,000 bugs. You just kind of, well, good enough. But anyway, iPhoto 2 shipped to, tens of millions of people. And we never did a 2.0.1 release. Like, we never needed to do a bug fix release. For the whole year, we shipped 2.0, and then we shipped 3.0. And nobody notices the lack of a bug fix release, but I was pretty proud of that. Most things, by the time you actually own any product nowadays, the first thing that happens is software updates itself, even if you just bought it like an hour ago. So the idea that you don't put bugs in, or you get all the bugs out, is sort of not very mainstream. People are busy cramming features in, and I think that matters. I'm embarrassed that in 2022, most software needs to be rebooted regularly, and people accept things that don't work very well. And like tech support, have you restarted? Like, why should you ever restart anything? It's because people can't fix the hard memory leak bugs and the things that are intermittent. They don't even try. So they've trained us to accept mediocrity. And it's when you launch a space shuttle, not a space shuttle, but like I think the Hubble telescope, they don't use the latest version of Windows or anything. They go back 20 years and find some old version of VMS that isn't being changed anymore. It's not that there's 0 bugs in it, but they know where all the bugs are because nobody's changed it in 25 years. Like, we're putting that in the space because we can't fix bugs. And we don't trust anything that's still being changed because we add as many bugs as we add features. And so anyway, that's a tangent, but I don't think we should be settling for stuff that kind of sucks a little bit.
Can you talk about your relationship with Steve and working with him?
Yeah, Steve was a complicated person, as everyone knows, and that veil of secrecy that he surrounded himself with means that most of what we hear about him is not corroborated by anybody who actually spent time with him, because those people still aren't talking. So some of it's true, some of it's not true. Most of it misses the point. He was, I think most of our legendary leaders are somewhere on the autism spectrum, sociopath type of people where they just don't care what human beings think about them. And, Elon Musk sort of admits that openly. Has Asperger's or whatever. But it creates this lack of need for approval or human reinforcement. And that can appear as arrogance or, being an asshole or whatever, but that's not really what it's about. It's more like he doesn't need your approval. And that changes the way he interacts with people. And he was very driven to accomplish things, never let up, even to the day he died. That's what drove him, is just doing more stuff. So if you came into his sphere of influence or his radar, not only did he not need your approval, he didn't care if you liked him or he just didn't really care about the human being side of things. So he wasn't mean per se, but he was impatient. So if somebody would come into the room and he detected that they weren't bringing a whole lot with them, he would sort of swat them out of the room in an unkind way, like, "You're an idiot, you need to leave right now," something like that, which is pretty brutal, but it was very efficient. Like, that person would leave immediately. And then if you were still in the room, he didn't say, like, "That person was an idiot." He was just like, it's sort of like, swatting a fly. So it was if you were that person, you had a bad opinion of him, like, "What a jerk," But if you were on the inside of the room, you're like, you didn't even say anything, like, "Okay, that annoyance is gone, that's good." So he was very protective of that space. And if you were inside that space, he was very easygoing, very easy to work with, very collaborative, funny, but it was a very closely guarded, sort of like what I imagine Vladimir Putin's inner circle to be, except for less of a sense of humor kind of a thing, but a very carefully curated group of people where he didn't need to be the CEO. He didn't have to be performing for anybody. And mostly he just was a team member. He had ideas, we'd argue about them. And we had this sort of, I call it a cauldron model, where people would put ideas into the cauldron and stir it, and you'd sort of forget whose idea it was, and that was an important piece of it. So a junior person's idea could be chosen as much as Steve's because you sort of purposely forgot whose ideas they were. But let's just pick the best ones and keep going. So, and he was pretty darn good at all of the aspects of product development and incessantly curious about technology and stuff. So he had a very informed point of view. And he would argue with the graphic designers about pixels, like, "That's 3 pixels," and he'd be like, "No, that's 2." And they would bet on, like, is that off by a pixel? He fretted at that level. And we, for the years I worked there, when iMovie and iPhoto and iDVD, they were new and interesting. So we had standing meetings every Thursday, I think it was. We would meet with Steve in the boardroom, because that's where he liked to meet, for 3 or 4 hours and just go through the products. And if you imagine that, 20, 30,000 employee company, and he's taking the time to spend several hours a week with these teams, like, that's what he wanted to do. And I asked him at one point, like, I don't know, like, I forget exactly what I asked him, but he said, "You know why I'm the CEO of this company?" He said, "I don't really like being the CEO, but nobody can tell me I can't do this." Like, it gave him permission to be a product manager, basically. And he was annoying at times, but because he never would just decide something was good enough, like, do it again, up until the point where we have to decide and then pick the best one. So you kind of knew that if you did your best work too early, it would be thrown out. Sometimes you could recycle things from 6 months ago and he would forget, and so you kind of save your best ideas for late in the game. But I won't say it was pleasurable necessarily, but it was very efficient and stress-free. Like, you kind of knew you had a special team, and all you had to do was bring your A game and do a good job. And Like, he never really got mad at me or anybody that I saw in those circles. He would have strong opinions, but if you had a reason that you disagreed with him, he'd hear you, and sometimes he'd be like, yeah, you know what, we're doing it my way anyway because I just want to win. And he could see, but like, it was arbitrary. Like, all right, doesn't really matter, so you get to pick. But and that's what he loved to do. And I think people would see the sort of edges of that, and misinterpret him. And, there are a lot of people who literally copied I need to be an asshole to be CEO. Like, you don't get it at all. Like, that's not what he was about. Like, if you thought he was an asshole, you probably sucked at what you did, is kind of what it came down to. Like, if you were competent and made it through that thing, he wasn't an asshole at all. And he would bait you, like, I can remember watching him sort of question somebody. I think it was somebody maybe somebody who wanted to work there, I don't know, but he'd say, like, what do you think of, I'm going to have to pick something here, like, what do you think of QuickTime? And whatever they said, like, oh, I think it's amazing and blah, 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 he'd say, well, I think it sucks. And then he would just wait and see what you said. And if you did a 180 and like, yeah, it really, like, you were immediately thrown out of the room, he would deliberately contradict you just to see whether you backed up your own opinion or not. A surprising number of people didn't, They would prep, like, I think he wants you to always agree with him, or I think he wants you to always contradict him. I've heard this, but, like, it was neither of those things. He just wants to know that you have thoughts of your own. And if you could back up what your opinion was, he was like, okay. But he would trick you and sort of see if he could get you to negate yourself. And he was very good at catching people and being obsequious or whatever. There's a story I heard of an employee, I don't know, maybe from Sun or somebody. They're going to hire him to do something important, and he met with Steve as a last step, which is rare, but this person was pretty important. And Steve said, I don't want to say Sun or SGI. He's like, are you the smartest person at SGI? He's like, and a very humble person, he's like, well, no. Not, I couldn't say I'm the smartest person. He says, well, who is? And he named somebody. He's like, well, this guy is smarter than me, kind of. So he kicked him out of the room and he called the other guy. Well, if there's somebody smarter than you, then why are we talking to you, was kind of his takeaway. And I think that person was a little shell-shocked by, I guess that was the wrong answer. There's no such thing as smarter than. There's sort of, it's all very contextual, but he was brutally efficient and driven, I guess. But I liked working with him. And there was an old TV show, Bewitched, that, the woman's a witch, her husband sort of works at an insurance company or whatever. And they would always have his boss over for dinner. That was a recurring plot line. And I remember thinking, could I imagine, like, inviting Steve over for dinner or having a beer with him? And the answer was just no. Like, I don't know if he did that. Maybe just not with me. But so it wasn't like a hang out with your coworkers after work type of a thing. But it was easy to do what you needed to do. Like, he also removed roadblocks and created an environment where you could just get shit done, and that's what I like to do, and that's what he liked, so it worked out well. There's one funny story my wife likes to tell. I built a tree house for my daughter, and I built it kind of high up in the tree, and eventually she made me build another story below because it seemed dangerous, but I was up in the tree about as high as the ceiling, which is, I don't know, 10 feet maybe. And it was the first few boards, so I'm kind of up there with my legs wrapped around the tree and on a rope and whatever. And she comes out, my wife comes out, with like the cordless phone, and she says, Steve Jobs is on the phone. He wants to talk to you. I'm like, tell him I'm literally up in a tree. And she says, he wants to know if I can throw the phone up to you. So she did. She like throws the phone up and I catch it and I'm talking to him. And it wasn't even important. He just had some idea about something, but he didn't want to be put off. You know, it was like, you take his call kind of a thing. And at that point, he was famous enough that people did take his calls and he could call anybody in the world. You know, I'll just call the president of Sony and ask him, that type of thing. And but yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but and the people like Avi Tavanian, who he hired out of graduate school, Mac OS became OS 10 eventually. Avi stayed with him for, I don't know, 30 years, you know, and a lot of his core people spent decades with him, and if he were a difficult person to work with, that wouldn't have happened. So he wasn't the easiest guy to deal with, but in the context of building stuff, it was easy enough, and you always felt like he encouraged you to bring your best game. Like, you knew deep down that if you were slacking or not getting something done, that it wasn't going to go well. So it definitely kept people on their toes. But yeah, definitely misunderstood. And oddly, not as brilliant as people make him out to be. Like, he was very good at synthesizing ideas. So, you know, stealing them in a way, like the user interface from Xerox, and like the iPhone's a good example where phones existed. You could even do internet type stuff. You could connect on them. Touch screens existed, but none of them had been put together in one. So kind of borrowing from another industry to solve a problem. He was very good at seeing things that weren't in the computer industry that had merit, and or just even combining, I don't know, iPods and things. They were synthesis comes to mind, as opposed to truly new things that never existed before. I'm not sure he ever did that. I can't think. Apple I was not the first, you know, microcomputer. So kind of repackaging things and combining things in a way that made them useful in the real world to regular people. He was very good at that. But, you know, Elon Musk's team figured out how to land a rocket backwards on a ship in the ocean. Like, that's truly amazing. And quadcopters are truly amazing. And none of that stuff in Steve's histories. So he democratized a lot of things and brought them to the masses. But genius isn't a word that I would have used. Although maybe genius at marketing he deserves. Like, he was definitely had that vision that few people do, which is odd because he didn't really like people all that much. So, like, pleasing people with products, but it wasn't really that. He was famous for not caring what other people thought they wanted, you know, sort of like, this is what I think everybody should like, and I'm going to make them like it by sheer force of personality. But it was only moderately successful. Like, Apple products don't have enough features. That's what they're mostly criticized for. Like, this is a toy. It doesn't have anything. It can't do this. It's too simple. And that's true because that was what his entire life was simplicity. You know, only silver and gray cars, only black turtlenecks. He had no furniture in his house. He just didn't like complexity, and therefore you shouldn't either, is kind of his product strategy. And luckily for him, most products are too complicated and have too much stuff, so simplifying is an effective technique in an overly complicated world. And maybe the only person I ever worked with who advocated taking things out of products, like what does that do? Get it out of there. The only person I've ever heard say that. And most of the time it's true, like, yeah, it doesn't really need that. But it wasn't that he truly understood what we wanted and gave it to us. It's like, no, you want what I want, and here's what it is, and I'm going to make you want it. And eventually that worked out pretty well.
Can you talk about iPhoto and the creation of iPhoto?
So I mentioned that iMovie was created to fill up your hard drive. Photos also fill up your hard drive, just not quite as fast. So, and we sort of accidentally started focusing on media because of this fill up your hard drive thing. So there's only three kinds of media, really. There's video, audio, and photo. So we did all of them, but iPhoto was second, sort of, and I just sort of knew we would eventually do it, and just sort of said, all right, I'll be the guy that does that too.
So was that a project that somebody higher up came up with, or was that something that
I
you
don't even
decided
remember. It was
you
just
were
sort
gonna
of
do?
just seemed obvious that it needed to be done. And we also, I think iDVD might have come second, where that was acquired. But with video,
Oh, that was an acquisition.
yeah.
But then it was part of your group.
Right. It became part of the iApps group, and eventually became sort of the apps division. But it sort of came out of like, oh, now we have movies. We should be able to burn them onto DVDs to make them viewable. So they went out and acquired iDVD. But then it's sort of like, well, we might as well keep going. So it's sort of an organic evolution. Like, well, let's do photos and songs while we're at it. So I don't know if somebody said go do it, or we just started working on it organically, but it was sort of obvious that we were going to get there. So, and I actually managed both of those groups and then proposed building the music app too. And the Jeff Robin, who built what is now iTunes, he was at Green something software. He was just a little third-party developer and had built this third-party app that played music. And
Oh, Cassidy and Green.
yes, Cassidy and Green. Wait,
He built Sound Jam, right?
Yeah.
Was
So anyway,
the app that became iTunes.
Yeah. So, but I had written a proposal. I wanted to do iTunes and was ready to do it. And I bumped into Jeff in the hallway one day. I'd met him somewhere along the way. I was like, Jeff, what are you doing here? And he's like, I work here. I was like, well, who do you report to? Or no, I said, what are you working on? He says, I can't tell you, which wasn't a surprise. I said, well, who do you report to? And he's like, Will Stein, who's my manager. I'm like, huh, that's weird, because I'm waiting for them to get back to me on building this music app. And basically they just didn't tell me that they were acquiring it instead of letting me build it, which made me mad, honestly. So when I finally got to the bottom of that, like, yeah, we just didn't tell you. I actually just quit. I was like, I don't need this kind of bullshit. I've been through corporate stuff, and it was maybe the only time in my life I literally dropped my badge on the table and said, I'm out of here. Because my whole career, I've never felt like I couldn't just get another job sort of tomorrow. So there's sort of an implicit contract around the people that you work with, a trust-based thing where, if it's not that, then what is it? So I left, and I went to work and I left iPhoto half done.
The 1.0.
Yeah. So, and that was also when OS 10 was starting to ship. So it was sort of a weird time to leave, but.
So this is 2001?
2000. I think it was the year 2000. And because we shipped iPhoto in 2001, so right around in there somewhere. But John Warnock, the Adobe founder, his son Christopher had started a company. It was a really good idea called eBrary, where most of the world's books at that point still weren't on the internet or still weren't searchable. So he was trying to license all these PDF files from publishers and index them and make them browsable and searchable, which eventually Google did with saws and scanners or whatever. But so I went to work for Christopher for 8 or 9 months, and I think Cena got in trouble for letting me disappear out of Apple, and he kept trying to hire me back. And I think Steve was like, what? You know, go get him back kind of thing. But I was still mad and having none of it. So over the course of 9 months, Cena was trying to hire me back, and I was having none of it. And then eventually he just said, he says, all right, we'll double your salary and pay you a $200,000 signing bonus to come back. And I was like, okay. That worked. So I came back and finished iPhoto and worked there for a couple more years, but it was a little bit of mini drama. But it wasn't emotional drama. It was just sort of like, no, I'm not doing that. And, you know, I did recognize my value and the power that I had, and I just like, I'm not going to hate my job. That's just not the way I'm going to go about this. So, and I've always had a contract with myself to never sell my soul to make money or anything like that. So I haven't made that much money in the grand scheme of things, but I'm okay with that, because I know a lot of people who hate their jobs for years hoping to make it big, and then even if they do, it's still not a trade-off that's worth it. So I've loved everything I've done. There's been a lot of moments of being out of money and stressed out, but I'd prefer that to a cushy job that I hate, you know. So I've given up great opportunities lots of times. I've given up safety and riches for authenticity and doing new things, and wouldn't trade it, I guess. But I realize not many people do that. There was a company when I was still consulting and hadn't gone back to Apple. Oh, no, I remember now. When I quit my job to go hang out with my daughter, I kind of got this job lined up so when I came back from my sort of sabbatical, they would hire me, and it was VP of engineering for a little company, Vitria, I think it was called. They did some weird networking thing, but they were small but going places. And during the time that I was not, after I'd accepted the job and before I started, they moved from downtown Palo Alto to over by Moffett Field somewhere. And when I found out, they were just about to move, so I showed up to my first day of work. And like, by the way, we're moving from this cool place in Palo Alto to Moffett Field area. And I was like, what? And it was a horrible commute for me, and it's just not that great of an area, despite the fact that you're not far from that here. I like the downtown foot traffic kind of thing. So after 3 or 4 days, I resigned. I said, you know what? I'm not signing up for a 45-minute commute and an oblique industrial landscape. And before I become engaged in this, I'm just not doing this. And they were sort of shocked, but they got it, I guess. But some few years later, they went public, and I went back and dug up my offer letter and my stock option grant and everything. And if I'd stayed and done that hateful commute for 2 years, I think I would have made $50 million. But I didn't second guess that. I was like, you know what? I might not have made $50 million, but I would have hated that commute and hated my job. So at the time, that was the right call to make. And everybody negotiates their life differently, but yeah, that's sort of why you end up doing something like quitting your job at Apple on short notice. Isn't about anything except wanting to love your job every day, I guess, is what it comes down to. I've been lucky that way. All these things that are not on your list of questions, sorry.
No. This is all really interesting. So I kind of want to go back to like the creation of sort of the iApps group just happened organically, as you said, and then led to this sort of digital hub strategy that Steve talked about. But it was not planned from the beginning. It was just kind of.
It was sort of. It happened semi-obviously by following the media path, but Apple was also growing and hiring people and acquiring companies, and they're getting to be a lot of people and actual marketing people, and so how do we sell this mishmash of weird products? So the marketing people sort of put wrappers around it and called it the digital hub and the iApps, and all those names they were labels for things that already had organically come into existence. And I'm trying to think, there was a couple other apps in that umbrella, but the iDVD and iTunes were the main ones.
Right. Then there was, eventually there was iWeb. I guess these were all packaged with the OS. They all came.
Yeah, they did try and sell them separately at some point, but they kind of gave up on that.
Right.
So yeah, they basically came built in. And it was a pretty powerful reason to buy a Mac at that point. There was a lot of pretty useful stuff that came with it.
Right. Then there was GarageBand later on.
Right.
Let's see, what else was there?
GarageBand is still there. I can't believe they ship it on every machine. For the small number of people who actually make music, it takes up a lot of your disk space, all their libraries and stuff. So I immediately uninstall it when I get a new Mac. It's a beautiful piece of software. I just don't need it for anything,
There's also was the iWork suite of applications, which includes Pages and Numbers.
Yeah.
Is that a separate group, or
that came much later? I think they basically, iMovie was 22 years ago or something. That's a long time in the computer industry. So at some point, there's one piece of software that came in from the next history. So Keynote was basically a reskinning of, what the heck was the name of it? But there was a Next developer who had built a presentation app, and I can't think of the name of it, but they acquired it because Steve liked it, and Keynote was named that. It was basically like, build me an app for doing my presentations exactly how I wanted. It wasn't really designed for other people to use at first. Why would you call it Keynote? He's the only one who does keynotes.
Was it, Concurrence? Was that?
Yes, Concurrence. I should be able to remember.
Lighthouse Design, was that the deal?
Yes,
okay.
Your memory's better than mine, or at least at this moment. These things always come back to me. So they bought that, and they had ported that from Next Step to Sun's Java-based OS. I forgot what that was called too. But basically, Steve was like, go get that and turn it into a presentation app for me. But that created the nucleus for other productivity apps, and I think that was a very separate group. And although I knew those guys to some extent from the Next community, I didn't interact with them. And that might have even come after I left. But Pages and Numbers were, I don't know who thought of that or why. It was sort of like, let's not be dependent on Microsoft Office is probably the genesis of that.
Right.
And I still use Microsoft Office. I don't like Pages and Numbers.
So Pages had nothing to do with the desktop publishing app that you had done back at Red Brain.
But I think it grew out of the Keynote engineering group that they, good app developers. I think they took it upon themselves to build all that stuff. Roger
Rosner? Is that the name?
No. Maybe, yeah, Roger Rosner is definitely part of that. Yeah, so I think he kind of spearheaded. I think he's still there, actually. but I don't know that history very well.
He was a third-party Next developer
Yeah.
as well.
He was at Lighthouse, I think. But yeah, I'm a little fuzzy on that stuff.
And then I think did he create an app called Tiffany?
Not familiar with
OS
that.
10. I'm not really sure. Okay. Anyway.
But very good guy and very capable. But I think they grew all that stuff internally.
Right.
You
So
know-
after you went back, you were still in charge of iPhoto, iMovie, iDVD.
I wasn't in charge of iDVD
Oh, okay.
or iTunes, so just iMovie and iPhoto. It was a little odd management structure. We didn't really care, but people owned the apps that they brought with them, essentially. So
Okay.
iTunes and iDVD were entire teams and products that came in the door, so they continued to own. And we all kind of reported up into the same management tree, but we were parallel. But since I had built iMovie and iPhoto, I owned those two apps, and I guess the rest of them were one app kind of managers, and Jeff ended up outlasting the rest of us, so he owned all of that at some point. But yeah, it was not thought through ahead of time so much as seeing an opportunity and jumping at it, and then seeing in retrospect, like, hey, we have 4 or 5 of these apps, we might as well come up with a name for them. And that whole fill up your hard drive thing, once accomplished, then very few people even realize that that's what the genesis of it was. But it's like, why is Apple doing these apps, you know? But once you started, then it's like, well, you get them for free. And I came from the old school idea that OS vendors should not compete with their third-party app vendors, you know. That's how we were brought up. Like, but Apple and Microsoft, somewhere along the way, they basically let a third-party developer prove that there's a demand for a certain type of app, and then they just go make their own and put that person out of business, which doesn't seem fair. Like even the flashlight app, like, you know, for a couple generations of iOS, you would go download a flashlight app and turn on that thing, and so you could see stuff. And then Apple just builds it in, and not so much for the flashlight app, you know. But I never thought that was the right way to go about it, and I still don't. I think if you want a vibrant third-party ecosystem, you don't compete with them. But some of that happens by accident. Some of it's very purposeful, but I guess there's enough app developers that you don't have to worry about that anymore. In the old days, if Adobe had built a page layout app and put PageMaker and Quark out of business, Adobe might have gone out of business too. You know, you really needed them when there were only a handful of them. And now there's over 1 million apps in the App Store. Like any given developer, I guess, is expendable.
Yeah. I mean, there's even a term for this, Sherlocking, they call it, because Sherlock basically did put this other third-party app, Watson, out of business.
Right, I forgot about that. Yeah, I guess it's the landscape we live with now.
So you mentioned later on that that eventually the Final Cut team replaced the iMovie sort of code base with their own code base.
Yeah.
So that was a much later version of iMovie?
It was probably 10 years after iMovie 1, so maybe 4 or 5 years after I left. I don't know exactly when it was, but it was, I think Randy built it himself in his spare time as a vengeance move or something. I don't think they needed to do it, and in my opinion, which is biased obviously, but it isn't as good as the old iMovie, and it more closely resembles the Final Cut. Final Cut was, well, that whole genre of movie editing was based on professional video editors who were basically arranging professionally shot video clips by real cinematographers into a work, you know. So the idea of in and out points, and you're trimming, but you basically have good footage, and you're making artistic decisions as to how to arrange it. I didn't even know what in and out points were. And when Steve hired me to build iMovie, I'm like, I don't know anything about video. He's like, that's okay. It felt like just a lot of Photoshop files in a row really fast. That's video. But I felt like, what's wrong with cut, copy, and paste? Like, let's use that model. Everyone knows that. No one knows in and out points. So, but it's a different premise. I used to call iMovie a crap removal tool. If you were if you had enough money to buy a DV camera in the year, whatever that was, 98, you were like a dentist or a professional, and you could afford a $2,000 video camera. So, but you didn't know anything about making movies. You're filming your kid's birthday party and whatever. So most of the footage that people were editing was shot by somebody's dad who forgot to turn the camera off while they're hiking, or you're yelling at your kid over the top of the camera. So mostly what you needed to do was delete stuff that you didn't want in your movie. It wasn't a matter of artfully arranging these beautifully shot clips. It was like, delete. That's the only key feature that has to work. And Randy always hated my approach to that because he came from that film world, and he sort of hated me because I got snuck in the side to build this thing. And I don't have any feelings negatively toward him, but I always knew that he didn't like iMovie. So when he finally made his own version of it, it wouldn't even read in existing iMovie projects. And it was a well-documented file format. It would have been easy to do. He just didn't want any connection to it. So if you were an iMovie user and you suddenly got a new version, you couldn't even open your old projects, and people weren't really all that happy with that. But it just was what it was, and nobody cared about iMovie at that point. It had become, it wasn't new, it was forgotten and free, so you can't really complain about free software, so that was just noise, like nobody cared. But there's a funny thing where iMovie was supposed to be an entry-level tool for people who had no idea what to do. But if it's your product and you own it, you kind of feel like you want to keep adding stuff to it and making it better. Mm-hmm. But the more you add to it, it no longer serves those entry-level people if you make it too sophisticated. So the best thing you could do is just nothing, like leave it alone. Let it be an entry-level thing, send everybody home, and don't change it, you know. So
plus there's also Final Cut Pro.
Right.
You don't want to get to the point where you're competing with Final Cut Pro.
Right. So, but product teams usually are like unsupervised third graders. Like, nobody tells them what not to do mostly, and so they just do what they want to do, and you get bored like maintaining something and not adding features to it. So you allow your programmers to add stuff. Like Microsoft Word, all the Microsoft products have way too many features. They're capable, but like, well, let's make a ribbon and make ways to hide all the features instead of just removing them. And I believe like teams should be allowed to add features for maybe the first 5 versions. Then they should be required to remove features for the next 5 versions, and then you can add again. But a lot of products could be improved by removing stuff, and no one does that. They just hide it deeper in like expert menu, or, you know, you go into some mode and like, I don't know.
Well, sometimes what Apple does is they completely rewrite the app, right. And then the new version removes a bunch of features and users complain. So like Final Cut 10 came out and it was a complete rewrite, and it removed a whole bunch of stuff.
Right.
And people were unhappy with it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a complicated thing, but it's a disease to rewrite stuff. And Photoshop was built on top of a technology, I believe it was when IBM and Apple tried to make the pink OS or something like that, they created this cross-platform layer that had a name that I can't remember anymore, but you
Intelligent?
could may have been Intelligent. That was certainly one of them. But
That,
there was
that
this,
was the name of the company that
Yeah,
spun out from Pink.
I don't remember the name of it, but there was a sort of it had its own idea of windows and buttons and everything so that it would work the same on two different OSs. And so Photoshop was built on top of this layer that never shipped and basically disappeared. Adobe had to acquire that technology just to keep Photoshop running. So it may still be under there, but for many years, like Photoshop was built on top of a abstraction that it just wasn't there anymore. So it's hard to even find somebody who could, create a new window using this weird toolkit from the past.
But that made it easy for them to maintain both a Windows.
No, it's no good reason
No.
to have it. It's just a big pile of crap underneath Photoshop.
Because I thought it made it easy to have a cross-platform app across Windows and Mac.
Sort of, but those cross-platform layers it isn't even cross-platform anymore. Like the Mac and the Windows version they evolve separately, and they take advantage of platform-specific features. So that was a thing in the 80s, but it's not a thing now. And they always had the worst middle ground of both operating systems, but they tried to get rid of it, and they wanted to get rid of it, but they kept making money, and they hired people and built parallel teams to make a new Photoshop, but they couldn't ever catch up with the real Photoshop, and they would abandon it. And Photoshop is the worst code base you could possibly imagine, and it just doesn't matter. I discourage people from trying to rewrite things and make them all wonderful, because you just end up with something different. It's not necessarily better. My motto is the CPU doesn't care. It'll execute whatever, and just leave it alone and build on top of it. And Photoshop is not elegant. I don't even like that word elegant, because it's the wrong motivation. Who cares what the code is like? Just make it do something useful. But yeah, rewriting, usually it's a team that doesn't want to inherit somebody else's code. It's a form of arrogance. We're going to just rewrite this, and no management team is strong enough to tell them, no, you're not doing that,
But doesn't this contradict that thing you said earlier about when you were required to delete stuff because the cassette tape failed to save it, and that meant that the subsequent versions were better because you had learned from the previous versions?
Yeah, if you have to start over, you can definitely build something using everything that you've learned, but that's less about the code base and more about you as an evolving programmer. If you're rewriting your own stuff, you can make it better, but you might also make it worse. You have to have a really good reason to rewrite something other than I don't like it anymore. So if it happens to you by accident, you just lose it, then you have to start over. Usually what you want to do is solve a problem, it's too slow, or it crashes, or most rewrites should be triggered by bad design. Maybe we started out with the idea of a flat architecture. We realize it's hierarchical now, and it's full of special cases and weird things because we designed it wrong. So just redesign that core piece of where you got it wrong, but usually stay on the right side of some API. So don't rewrite the whole thing. Rewrite the storage engine or rewrite the display side, but one thing at a time, so you can keep stuff that works and rewrite something that just, it's either hard to maintain or it just was designed badly in the first place. But usually that's more of a heart transplant. You're not replacing the person, you're surgically replacing a faulty piece. But when you rewrite the entire app, it isn't the same app, it's just a different app. Maybe write a different app and leave that one alone. I'm not sure. Adobe, I don't know if they did this out of an act of brilliance or just expedience, but they have a huge office in India, which more or less just maintains apps. They don't have the mindset of like, we're the Illustrator team, we're doing amazing stuff. It's more like our job is to keep porting this to the new OSs and keep it from breaking. And it's one of the best things that can happen to a product is go into maintenance mode and just quit trying to make it better. Just, and they've changed little things that kind of sucked about it, but they're not aggressively going after 3D rendering inside Illustrator. They're not doing big stuff. They're just making it be a little bit better every time. And very few companies do that. Microsoft does that now. They didn't used to, but, they'll rev Office like every 5 years or something. It's like, it's fine, and they're right. It is fine. And it's rare that you find somebody who says, this vendor changed a whole bunch of stuff and I love it. Like almost no one loves dramatic levels of change or even any change. Like you change the keystrokes on me or you move something and now I have to learn it again. And yeah, we're addicted to change as a society and addicted to newness. But in the database world, I took a class in, relational databases, and then when I got into the Unix world, I found Berkeley DB. It's a flat file database. It's been in Unix since 1965 or something. And then I read about these, flat file Mongo NoSQL databases. I'm like, have you heard of Berkeley DB? It's been around and it has no bugs in it. Like it does exactly the same thing. But young people especially, they don't even know that ever existed. So they're like, we want the opposite of MySQL. Let's do a key values flat file. Never mind that you could just go get one for free that's better and faster. So some change is just because of people needing to change stuff, and some of it is meaningful and well advised, but
right.
Most of it is the former. It's just like, let's just make a new one because we don't want to work on something old and crufty.
Well, I mean, at Apple, it's a tension because I remember, as soon as something went into maintenance mode, that was almost code for its end of life.
Yeah, but that's wrong thinking. Like, that means we've nailed it and we can just keep it the same, especially if it's intended for new users, like, entry-level things. If you get that right, then you're always going to have new users. And the idea that you keep the same users and you evolve with them is somewhat unusual. I think every year you get a new crop of people who just graduated from kindergarten and they want to use the computer the first time or whatever. And they obviously can figure anything out, kids these days, but most apps have a place in the ecosystem. They serve a purpose. And take Microsoft Word. I know a lot more than most people about word processing and page layout. Word is a word processor. It needs to do that well. But I know very few people who even use styles or tabs, much less the rest of the features. They just type stuff in and they print it. So what does all the rest of that stuff do? And, maybe you need revision control and markup for lawyers or whatever, but most people use the space bar to indent stuff, and they use the carriage return to get to the next page. They don't insert page break or any of that stuff, and they never will. They don't use the app. Photoshop, nobody knows how to use most of the features in there. They open something, they adjust the contrast, and they save it. But I believe over the last 150 years, we have evolved from people who build their own house, grow their own food, subsistence farming, if you will, to you go and work some job and you pay people to build your fence and paint your house and cook your food. So we're becoming detached from our own lives in such a way that we don't know how to do anything anymore. Occasionally people realize that and feel bad about it. So I want to be a woodworker, and they'll go to the store to buy a table saw. And you turn into this weekend warrior, you know. And if there were two models of table saws in the store, and one was called the Contractor Pro and the other was called the Weekend Hobbyist, which one are you going to buy, you know? Well, you're not worried about cutting boards. You're worrying about buying back your soul of the person that you aren't because you're an accountant. You buy the Contractor Pro saw to feel good about yourself, and you bring it home and you cut one board with it and you never use it again, but you feel like you've recaptured some missing piece of your soul. That's exactly what Photoshop is. Like, you used to be, you bought it and you put it on your shelf to show people that you own Photoshop. You have no idea how to use it, and neither do they, but it's impressive. Like, wow, you have Photoshop? You must be you must be cool. You must be a designer. But whether you know how to use it or not is a totally different matter. But that's the only thing that explains why people buy these things that they don't need. And no one's ever successfully built a low-end photo editor that's just does the 5 things you care about, because everyone just keeps buying Photoshop because it's the Contractor Pro model. And there is something psychological about that. People don't want the lightweight version, or they don't think they want it. And so we create more demand for. It's sort of like people buying pickup trucks who never actually put anything in the back or take it off road or whatever. You sort of want to believe you're the kind of person who could drive in the mud if you wanted to.
Yeah, right. So, going to wrap up with a few questions. So, I guess quickly talk about so your third stint at Apple. What made you decide to leave? The third time, and then
I was only at Apple twice. I was at Adobe 3 times.
Okay.
Maybe that's what you're thinking.
I guess. I guess you count the temporarily leaving.
Yeah.
As one going back, and
there were still only 2 times I went there. I left for 9 months. I came back, but I didn't work there the third time.
Right. That's actually 2, right?
Yeah.
So the second time you left Apple was.
So the second time. We were up to iMovie and iPhoto 4 or something like that, and I was leaning back in my chair one day and realized that Apple had become a successful company, and when I started it wasn't, and that I liked it better when it was struggling. And I did a lot of reflection and realized I don't like working for successful companies because they attract the wrong kind of people. They attract people who want to work for you because you're successful and they want it on your resume and they want to brag about the fact that they just got a job at Twitter or whatever. But they're not necessarily bringing anything to the company. They're more making withdrawals than deposits, kind of. And so you graduate from college and you go work at Apple and a cool job. But I found that the hot tub was sort of filling up with the wrong kind of people, and it was time for me to get out. And these people, I call them sort of zero value people. They weren't negative value, but they weren't really adding anything. They were just calling meetings and being nice and having conversations, and it was just diluting it was almost impossible to do anything because you're invited to a meeting from some nice person who, you can't hate the people, but they're not fired up, they're not motivated, they're not doing anything. And most companies drag 90% of the people in the companies are dead weight. They're just coming along for the ride. And like the other 5 to 10% of the people are doing everything. And I still don't know why middle management exists. That's a whole nother thing. But so anyway, I just sort of felt like this isn't exciting anymore and we're just doing the same old stuff. So I planned my departure that time. I was like, I'm going to go start a company and do something interesting. And it took me a while to figure out what that was, but It was peer-to-peer networking, file sharing, messaging kind of stuff back when AOL Instant Messenger was the only kind of thing going on. But I built group-based messaging in 2003, and it was sort of before all that stuff is pretty prevalent now. But so I quit to do that and got some venture capital, built a company, got Adobe Ventures to invest. The Granite Ventures, who ran Adobe Ventures' actual fund, they just sort of never really got what I was doing and didn't care. So they eventually just sort of kicked me out and sold it off to Cisco. But if they hadn't, I think we could have been much bigger. Not that I care about that, but it was a pretty successful exit. I think we returned 23 times our investors' money or something, and I made enough money to reinvent myself. Although, actually, during the tail end of that company, which was about 4 years in, so this is about 2007.
This was Five Across?
Yeah, Five Across. And my board guy, who, owned 51% of the company, more or less forced me out of the CEO role, and instead of becoming demoted and demotivated, I decided to just leave, and I went back to Adobe and worked in an advanced technology group for a while. But then they managed to sell my company without me, which I don't know why. That's a whole other story, because the people who came in after me threw away all my code and started over, so they had nothing to sell. I wasn't there, and the code was not there, so they sold an empty basket. That's the way I look at it, but I benefited from that. But I made enough money that I could tell Adobe that I'm not working here anymore. But
So they sold your company while you were at Adobe,
right,
and that allowed you to...
Well, I still had some stock, but
right.
I gave up a huge amount of my stock to not work there anymore. I think I owned 3 or 4% of the company by the time it was done, but I was okay with that. But I realized at that point that the software industry had become, it was no longer about products, it was about entertainment. Like, if you give something away for free and sell ads to support it, and it's vaguely addictive and fun, that's what TV used to be in the 60s, And most mainstream software today is exactly that: Facebook and TikTok and Instagram. It's TV, it's entertainment with ad sales. And you do have to build it, but so there's engineering in it, but it's not a product. And I realized deep down I'm a product guy. I want somebody to want to give me money in exchange for something of value, that value proposition thing.
Right, software is sold as a service now, not as a product.
Well, even software is sold as a service. If you're paying for it and it's solving a problem, that's a product.
Okay.
But if you're using it for free because it's fun and the money's coming into the company by advertising, then that's not a product to me, and that's a fine point, I suppose. But I kind of went back and realized that mechanical, physical products people are still willing to pay for. People don't really like to pay for digital things. So I kind of spent a few years reinventing myself and learning about manufacturing and realizing that everything mechanical nowadays is controlled by computers, and most electrical and mechanical engineers are horrible programmers, so it makes you more dangerous to be a good programmer in a mechanical world than a good mechanical engineer with a dim grasp of programming. So I started a company to develop ideas in that realm. That software was a secondary aspect of it. It was what made it go, but that wasn't the point. And accidentally stumbled into the fact that we have washing machines and dryers, which is ridiculous because they evolve separately. Like, you don't have a dishwasher and a dish dryer. They should just be one machine. So that bugged me for 2 or 3 years, and I finally decided to go start a company to solve that. And there's a lot of lines of code in a smart appliance with a touch screen that's internet connected, like a lot of my networking stuff was valuable in that, and we are more competitive than Whirlpool and companies that don't know how to build internet-connected stuff. They kind of do, but they kind of don't. So
that's your company,
Marathon Machines, yeah. And it's sort of like Nest thermostats. I know the guy that started that company, and they were a mediocre thermostat, but they were the first one that was internet connected, and ostensibly was to, set the temperature when you weren't home, but they really were a data mining company, and they could figure out when you were home or not because they had a motion detector, and they ended up selling themselves to Google for, I don't know, $2 billion because of the data pipeline of this person's home and whatever. So it's kind of a Trojan horse where you allegedly are a thermostat, but really you're a motion spy or whatever. We're a little bit that, like we know when you're doing laundry and how many people are in your household and what their names are, and Procter & Gamble salivates over that kind of data. So something being smart and connected, sometimes it's for you and sometimes it's for the big data monster that you fear. And we're more benevolent than that. We don't sell anybody's data right now, but I realize that deep down that data is valuable much beyond its value to you to get your laundry done. So maybe Procter & Gamble will buy us for $2 billion, and we're just a little bit bigger than a thermostat. But in the meantime, it's fun and interesting, and it's a problem that everybody has. Everybody has to do their laundry, so it's very utilitarian.
Is everything in the smart home and IoT space basically the same in terms of being basically a data mine?
I don't think people even know why they're doing it. They just are trying it to see what happens. And in particular, Samsung and LG, who South Korean companies, I believe, still are largely owned by the government. There's sort of a fuzzy line there. And, I think it's Samsung. They make ocean liners. They make everything, touchscreen. So these technology companies have all this stuff in the back room, and they're just like, let's make a refrigerator and put a bunch of stuff in it and see what happens. Like, they're not trying to solve a problem. They're just like, let's try a camera and a touchscreen and see if people want that. They're kind of throwing ideas at the wall. I'm not sure anybody really needs a smart refrigerator. And what does it tell you? That it's 39 degrees just like yesterday. So these things aren't always done on purpose. They're just because people are trying stuff. And the smart home has been attempted back in the 70s. I think there was X10 wireless. You could turn a light on by using your house wiring to put a switch here and communicate with it digitally over there. And light switches work pretty well. So it's still never solving a problem that most people actually have. And eventually you accidentally solve a problem that's worthwhile, but I would say motion detectors were a much bigger step forward in lighting than getting out your phone and turning on the light from your phone. So I think that's an unanswered question. To me, though, of the things you do in your home, a small number of them are tasks. So you actually have to wash the dishes, mow the lawn, do the laundry. You're actually doing it, as opposed to the refrigerators keeping your food cold. When it's a task, you interact with it differently. Like, you put something in the washing machine, you kind of want to know if it's done or not. So interacting with a task-based machine makes a lot more sense than interacting with a non-tat, like a light bulb or whatever. So a remote control snowblower or remote control lawnmower, those things make a lot of sense. Like, if you could stay inside and watch your lawnmower mowing your lawn, why wouldn't you want that? But you still might want to monitor it and stop it and control it. So I think we have to be thoughtful about solving problems that people actually have. A light switch is a remarkably good interface for turning a light on. It's right by the door when you come in, and you can do it with your elbow. It's better than your smartphone for turning lights on, and I think most people realize that, except to get the thrill for a while and turning it on from their phone. But you have to be solving a problem deep down. And, the venture capitalists always say that, like, what problem are you solving? It's such a cliche that people forget to take it seriously. But I don't know anybody who's complained about how hard it is to turn the lights on in their house. Sometimes they complain about the lack of a switch in exact location. That I get, but that's rare. Like, that's not a problem that most of us have. But laundry is like, everyone forgets their laundry in the washing machine and gets mad and forgets it the next day, and then they rewash it. And it's refreshing that people get excited about that. No one gets excited about laundry or mowing the lawn. And there do exist robotic lawnmowers. I don't have a lawn, but I would be the first guy to buy one of those. Like, I want to sit in here and watch it out the window. I don't want to be out there pushing it myself. But nobody has a lawn in Silicon Valley, so that's a non-problem here. But yeah, I think I call myself a product guy now, because it's not about software, it's not about engineering, it's about, if I can do something that makes you want to give me $20 for it, that fundamental exchange of value, that never goes away. And the motivation for giving you money for something isn't always as pure as solving a problem, like my Contractor Pro example. Like, you don't necessarily buy a table saw because you need one. You buy one because you want to be the kind of person that, and there's a huge amount of that. You buy an expensive bike in spandex and you ride your bike once, or you buy skiing equipment and you ski once, or whatever. So the rental industry does well. But fundamentally, I think value is there. If you are buying back your soul by spending $200 on a contractor, you're still seeing value there, even if later on you kick yourself because you're not sawing boards anymore. I think gym memberships are the best example of that. How many people, they're brilliant. They sell you a membership and don't tell you that you're still paying for it. And who wants to admit that they're not working out and cancel their gym membership?
What do you think of Apple's App Store ecosystem and how it's developed?
I think that there's way too many apps, and I guess that is a marketplace, but we all have apps that we don't use, we download. They're so cheap that people just dabble in things, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I do have a complicated relationship with the walled garden monitoring. You're not allowed to do this and this. It feels draconian at some level, but it also keeps a lot of malware out of the mix, and probably is better than worse in the long run. But as an app developer myself, it's annoying sometimes. I kind of prefer the open model where I can buy an app from anywhere and install it. You can still sort of do that. Like, I download apps. I guess they all eventually go through the App Store on the Apple phones especially, but I don't know. I'm not a heavy user of apps. I kind of have the minimal few, and by and large, it's a good thing. There's a lot of things that people have done that are kind of amazing, and like, what constellation is that in the sky? So it's a little bit like a false dream. Like, I know a lot of people who think they're going to make money writing apps, and a friend from Adobe, a very competent guy, he and his wife built some apps, and he says, when Apple featured it in their apps of the day, we made money, and the rest of the time we didn't make money. Like, there's just too many out there. You do it sort of to learn how to write apps, or because to solve your own problem, but it's pretty hard actual marketplace. And the ones that are widely downloaded and used are making money in the sort of on advertising or on in-app purchases or all that stuff. But I don't think there's very many of them that are actually making money.
Yeah. And you've never considered making an app for the iPhone or
Well,
iPad?
we have an app for Marathon that is an iPhone app, so you can monitor your laundry, but it's no use if you don't have a Marathon machine. So, and I've built apps for myself, like I built my own to-do list app because I don't like any of the other ones, and it's on the App Store, but I'm pretty sure I'm the only person who's ever downloaded.
So you made it for yourself, but you just put it on the store just.
Well,
for
I
the
tried to
heck of it.
get my wife to use it and my friends, and they just didn't. And they still use Post-it notes and stuff. But I think, to me, a to-do list it's a database of all the things you ever want to do for the rest of your life. And what your to-do list is the search results of what do we want to do right now. Some of it's location-based. So I'm in the hardware store. What do I need from the hardware store? So tagging and classifying things such that you can never forget to buy something at the hardware store because it knows you're at the hardware store and it pops up things like, you need this. It's a model that most people don't like. They sort of want this Post-it note where they scribble things out, but then they don't know what to do when the sun goes down. And do I keep this Post-it note for tomorrow? Or do I copy it onto a new list? And it's very primitive, but I've tried to get other people to use my app and they just don't, so I don't know what that says. But I use it all the time because it's not really about to-do lists, but if you're half asleep and you think of something, it's optimized to just tap something in and save it so you don't ever forget that you had an idea. Like, don't forget to, call Hansen about where you're actually going to be in November or whatever. It's on the list somewhere, and I can get to it when I need to, but I forget a lot less things than I used to. And it's a moderately complicated app in the cloud-based server thing, but nobody cares. I built a couple apps for friends as contract work that do useful things, so I know how to do it and stuff, but I wouldn't start a company to try to make money doing that, I guess. Unless it was something that's truly hard for anybody else to do. But that's pretty hard nowadays to come up with something there.
Yeah.
It's sort of the same thing as Mac or Windows apps. Third-party apps are an ecosystem, as you call it, and it's good that exists, and you can kind of find an app to do almost anything. But we all have apps that we don't use, whether it's Photoshop or tides near me, which, when I'm at the beach, I want to know the tides, and when I'm not at the beach, I don't need it. But yeah, I'm not sure what that answered your question about what I thought of the ecosystem, but I don't have any deep thoughts about it.
Well, at least it seems like you've definitely most of your maybe this is talking the next, I guess, the last question, which is really more about summarizing or reflecting back on your career and the impact you've made, which has been early part of yours mostly been developing applications, and the fact that you've now moved away from that, you're working on like real hardware now. That says something about the sort of the trajectory of the software industry, that you don't see it as a place where it's easy to solve someone's problem that still needs to be solved, or to create value, or that the market, or maybe the way that the market is organized now around in-app purchase or ads or subscriptions is no longer a place that is conducive to making applications for end users.
Well, I guess I would put it a little differently. So an application isn't a thing. It's just sort of a housing for a solution to some problem. So what I think is only a certain number of problems exist inside computers or the internet or your phone. It's only when you reach outside the digital world, I won't say only, but there are far more problems in the physical world than there are in the digital world. If you look at it as problems, very few of us have actual problems in the digital world. Like texting, communication is probably one of them. Like I need to get a hold of my daughter who's waiting for me to pick her up at school. Like that's an actual problem. Most of what we call apps and software are elective cosmetic surgery. They're things that are fun or interesting, but we don't really need them. And we just want them for whatever reason. So it's not that there are no longer any interesting problems in the digital realm, but there never were that many to begin with. Like, you know, even publishing, like, I used to think out loud to myself, what's left over when you turn off your computer? And if the answer is nothing, then it's all still in your computer. Like you haven't done anything. If you printed it out and gave it to somebody, that's sort of, that accomplished something. If you emailed it to somebody, you can turn your computer off. Like whatever made it out of your computer, out of your world, into the rest of the world. In the digital world, almost all of that is communication, if you really boil it down. Social networking, you're communicating with other people through some model. That has always been a problem worth solving, and that will continue to be solved. And there's still room for new ways to communicate that we haven't thought of yet, and there's obviously issues with existing ways we've thought of. But, and I may go back there, who knows, but to me, right now there are far more problems in the physical world than there are unsolved problems in the digital world. And, you know, if I built a social network or a communications app, that's a pretty full landscape. Like it would be difficult to succeed at that. But if I make a touch screen washing machine and it's the only one in the world, it's a little less competitive landscape, I guess. And a friend of mine once told me they thought I was a negative person. I'm the most optimistic person ever. But I realized that I see fault with everything. Like I see what sucks in the world. I see it as opportunity. Like I could make that better. I could make that better. But when you say out loud, like that sucks, you sound negative. So I learned to quit saying that because you do sound negative. But a lot of people don't look at the world in terms of what sucks about it and what could be improved. They just sort of accept whatever's there. And I think it was JFK or somebody who said, I don't look at the world as it is and say why. I look at the world as it could be and say why not, you know. So everything can be improved, and sometimes there's a market there, sometimes there's not. But I improve things that nobody sees but me, you know, like the inside of your drawer or whatever. Like there's something important to me about making something a little bit better than it was, or tidying something up, or repairing something, or building something. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning. And there's far more things needing repair and whatever than there are apps that need to be written. So for now, at least, I'm out in the real world solving those kinds of problems. It's a lot harder. It's expensive, and there's no multiple undo when you're, you know, sawing pieces of metal and all that. So there are a lot fewer people attempting it, I guess, because it's more difficult. But it's still fun, and there's, like I say, there's still no shortage of problems to solve. So I guess I have that same disease that Steve did. Like, I'm just going to keep doing stuff until I can't anymore. But I don't take vacations, especially when it's my own company, because whatever you're thinking about or working on, it follows you around. If you're awake, you're thinking about it. So if you go to the beach it's nice for about 30 minutes. Pretty soon you're like getting impatient because you thought of something and you want to do it. What I realized, so I take micro vacations, I call them. I go to lunch and don't come back for 3 hours, but that's as long as I'll sort of decouple from thinking about stuff. But what makes me happy is finishing things and accomplishing things. It doesn't matter what it is, sweeping the floor. Like if I haven't done anything by the end of the day, I don't feel good about it. And I used to be somewhat cynical about meditation and mindfulness and all that stuff. My wife is all about that stuff. But when I had friends explain it to me, a lot of what meditation is supposed to be about is clearing your head of stuff that's bugging you by replacing it with something simpler, like count your breaths, or what you're focusing your mind on something small and meaningless, so that you can free your mind from thinking about all that other more complicated stuff. And I realized I've done that all along. I just didn't know it was meditation. To me, it's sweeping the floor. Like when I'm sweeping, it requires just enough of your brain to forget about all the rest of your crap. Like you're thinking about getting that one piece in the corner or whatever. And it has all the same value as meditation, except you're getting something useful done at the same time. So I don't usually finish sweeping the floor. Like I make a pile and then go run and do something else. But there's an amazing number of things that you can busy yourself with, doing the dishes or whatever, where it is a form of meditation, but you can feel good about clean dishes at the end of that hour too. So it sort of doesn't matter to me. Like I don't do this stuff to make money. I don't do it to make other people happy. I do it to have a sense of accomplishment, and if the side effect is other people like it too, that's great. And I do need some money to pay my bills and stuff, so I do build things and sell them to people. But that's the part I like the least, is actual customers and money and all that stuff. It'd be nice if that didn't have to be. Somebody asked me once do you like the feeling of shipping an app like iMovie to millions of people? I said, no. Like I'm hiding under my desk because what if something's wrong with it? Like the opportunity to disappoint people is far greater than the opportunity to make them happy. In fact, most people are only happy for 1 week no matter what you give them. Like no matter how amazing it is, it wears off in a week and then they're complaining about it again. So that's less the motivation. But yeah, that was a bizarre answer to your question, I suppose.
Well, thank you. We're out of time, so thank you for coming today. And
absolutely,
had a really enjoyable time.
I appreciate your putting up with my rambling, and hopefully most of it will end up on the cutting room floor. But not very many people have asked me these kinds of questions, so you've got me reviewing my own life. I don't usually look in the rearview mirror. So I'll be glad to not do that anymore for the rest of the afternoon.
Right. Any last words or anything you want to summarize about looking back? Any common thread throughout?
Maybe just a very high-level thought, which is, as a society, as a people, as a country, if we stop making stuff, we're dead. If we're taking a percentage of transactions of somebody else's work, like we've forgotten to produce stuff and make stuff, and I think that's deep down what I'm all about, and I think what we all need to be about. If we're not making something, then you're just using up resources. So that's coming back a little bit with the maker movement and people learning to make their own food again, but we're about 100 years away from really being back to that mindset. And it's amazing how many people make money by side effect of something that somebody else is doing, whether you're finance is the biggest example of that. I'm going to take a percentage of that fee that my computer is processing your transaction. Like, they're not doing anything, they're just taking a fee. So I don't know why that popped into my head, but that's the thread for me is, are you making something? And if not, you should be.